At an upscale downtown restaurant, my son insisted on booking. His wife proudly announced she was pregnant. Before I could even finish swallowing my steak to properly congratulate them, my son looked me dead in the eye and said they needed my 4-bedroom house. He casually suggested I sign over the deed immediately and move into a small apartment because it was more suitable for an old man living alone. He spoke with the confidence of a man ordering a cheap appetizer. I smiled, said congratulations on the baby, then asked him why exactly their housing situation was my problem. The entire restaurant seemed to go completely silent. My name is Eugene Holloway. I am 69 years old, a retired building contractor, and a man who refuses to be treated like a disposable resource by his own flesh and blood. Before I continue telling you how a simple family dinner turned into a ruthless war for my dignity, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to entitled family members who tried to exploit your lifetime of hard work. I never raised my son to be a beggar dressed in a tailored suit, but that night I realized he had transformed into exactly that. The audacity of his request did not just insult me, it erased decades of my history. It erased the struggles I endured to secure a piece of this world for my family. He sat across from me, swirling an expensive glass of wine, waiting for me to hand over the keys to my kingdom, simply because he had decided he was ready to inherit it. Darren leaned forward, interlacing his fingers on the crisp white tablecloth. He used that corporate management voice he had perfected over the years, the one meant to sound entirely reasonable but masked pure, unadulterated entitlement. He started lecturing me about family responsibility. He said a child needs space to grow, a large yard to play in, and a safe neighborhood with good schools. He pointed out that my house was practically empty now that his mother Diane was gone. He framed the situation as a logical transition, as if my home were a piece of surplus inventory ready to be reassigned to the most needy department in his life. He told me it made zero financial sense for an old man to occupy so much square footage. I looked at his hands resting on the table. They were soft, manicured hands. He had never held a framing hammer or poured a yard of concrete. He did not know the blood, the sweat, and the sheer willpower it took to build a life from dirt. 40 years ago, I was a young black man fighting for every single construction contract in a city that actively worked to keep me at the bottom. Diane and I bought a vacant, overgrown lot when nobody else saw its potential. I poured the foundation of that 4-bedroom house with my own bare hands. I framed the walls during the freezing winters. Diane picked out the oak cabinets and painted every inch of the trim. Every nail driven into that house represented a sacrifice we made so Darren could grow up without ever knowing the bitter sting of poverty. Now he was looking at my life work as a convenient real estate upgrade for his growing family. Megan chimed in, adjusting her designer scarf, confidently stating that they had already started looking at paint colors for the nursery. She mentioned that the room receiving the best morning light would be perfect for the baby. That room was currently my home office, the room where Diane spent her final days reading. They had mentally evicted me before the appetizers even arrived on the table. I let them finish their perfectly rehearsed pitch. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of anger or hurt. I simply took a slow sip of my ice water, carefully wiped my mouth with the linen napkin, and offered a polite, icy smile. "Congratulations on the baby," I said, looking directly at Megan, then shifting my piercing gaze to my son. "But why exactly is your lack of space my problem?" Darren blinked hard, the confident corporate mask slipping from his face for a fraction of a second. He stammered, repeating that they were family and that I did not need so much room anymore. Megan's fake, polite smile vanished instantly. Her face flushed a deep, angry red as the reality of my refusal set in. She slammed her hand flat against the table, rattling the expensive wine glasses and drawing the attention of nearby diners. She loudly proclaimed that I was being a selfish, cold-hearted old man. She demanded to know how I could deny my own unborn grandchild a proper, safe home. She tried to use public shame to bend my will, creating a scene to force my compliance. I did not entertain her calculated tantrum for a single second. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a crisp $50 bill. I placed it neatly under my water glass to cover the exact cost of my steak and my drink. "I provided a proper home for my child," I told Darren, my voice steady, deep, and unwavering. "It is your job to provide one for yours. Do not ever ask me to hand over the foundation I built so you can avoid laying your own." I stood up from the table, adjusted my coat with absolute composure, and walked out of the restaurant. I left them sitting there in stunned, humiliated silence, surrounded by the judging whispers of the other patrons. I walked to my truck with my head held high. I did not look back once. The drive home was quiet and solitary. I felt a heavy disappointment settling deep in my chest, a profound sorrow recognizing the greedy type of man my son had chosen to become. I truly thought setting a firm, immovable boundary would be the end of the discussion. I assumed the public embarrassment at the restaurant would teach them that my property and my dignity were not up for negotiation. I unlocked my front door, the solid oak door I had hung myself 3 decades ago, and went straight to bed, hoping a good night of sleep would wash away the bitter taste of the evening. I woke up early the next morning at my usual time, a habit ingrained from decades of working construction. I walked into the kitchen to brew a strong pot of black coffee. The morning sun was shining brightly through the window Diane used to love so much. I reached toward the wooden key rack mounted on the wall by the side door to grab my garage key. My hand stopped in midair. The brass hook where I always kept the spare set of house keys was completely empty. A cold, sharp realization washed over me. The boundary I set at dinner was not the end of the conflict. It was merely their declaration of war. I did not waste a single second standing in my kitchen wondering what to do next. I grabbed my jacket, locked the side door behind me, and drove straight to the hardware store to buy 3 heavy-duty deadbolts. I knew exactly who took those keys, and I knew I had a very narrow window of time to secure my property, but I was already too late. As I turned the corner onto my quiet suburban street an hour later, I saw a massive yellow moving truck parked illegally across my driveway. The heavy metal ramp was fully extended, crushing Diane's prized hydrangea bushes near the walkway. 2 burly men in matching uniforms were struggling to carry an oversized modern velvet sofa up my front steps. And standing right there on my porch holding a clipboard and a large iced coffee was Megan. She was pointing and barking orders at the movers as if she owned the place. She had used my stolen spare key to unlock my front door and let complete strangers track dirt onto my hardwood floors. The sheer blinding audacity of the scene defied logic. I parked my truck on the street, killed the engine, and stepped out. I did not yell. I did not run. I walked up my driveway with the slow, measured steps of a man who was about to dismantle a delusion. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a calculated invasion. They honestly believed that if they forced their way in, if they created a reality where their furniture was already sitting in my living room, I would simply bow my head, surrender my life's work, and walk away in defeat. Megan spotted me approaching, and her posture immediately stiffened. She quickly plastered on a sickly sweet, entirely fake smile that did not reach her eyes. She trotted down the porch steps, acting as though she were greeting me at her own front door. She cheerfully announced that Darren was at the office wrapping up a presentation, so she decided to take the initiative and get the move started early. She spoke to me with the patronizing tone one might use on a confused toddler. She actually had the nerve to pat my arm and tell me not to worry about packing my things. She proudly declared that she and the movers had already boxed up my bedroom and stacked everything neatly in the garage, ensuring I could easily load it into a rental van whenever I found a suitable apartment. I looked past her and ordered the 2 movers to drop the sofa immediately. The men froze, sensing the intense, unyielding authority in my voice, and slowly lowered the heavy furniture onto the grass. Megan's fake smile vanished, replaced by an ugly, aggressive scowl. She stepped in front of me, crossing her arms, and dropped the polite act completely. She told me I was being ridiculous, that the house was practically theirs anyway, and that I needed to stop embarrassing myself and accept the transition. I told her she had exactly 5 seconds to get her belongings off my property before I treated her like any other home invader. The moment she realized I was not going to back down, her entire demeanor flipped. She deployed her ultimate weapon. She began to sob hysterically. She clutched her stomach, gasping for air, playing the role of a terrified, oppressed pregnant woman. She wailed loudly, ensuring the movers and the neighbors stepping out onto their porches could hear her. She cried out that I was attacking her, that I was causing extreme stress to her unborn child, and that I was a cruel, violent man kicking his vulnerable daughter-in-law onto the street. She weaponized her white tears with expert precision, calculating that the sight of a weeping pregnant woman facing off against an older black man would instantly turn the public against me. I did not argue with her. I did not raise my hands or step toward her to defend myself against her theatrical accusations. I knew better than to play into that dangerous narrative. I simply pulled my smartphone from my pocket, dialed 911, and calmly reported a burglary and trespassing in progress at my exact address. Megan stopped crying for a fraction of a second, her eyes widening in pure panic before she frantically pulled out her own phone to call Darren. Less than 10 minutes later, a police cruiser pulled up with its lights flashing. 2 officers stepped out, hands resting on their utility belts. Megan immediately rushed toward them, tears streaming down her face, pointing a shaking finger at me. She fed them a frantic story about a family dispute, claiming this was her home, that she was pregnant, and that her father-in-law was having a mental breakdown and turning violent. Right as she was finishing her performance, Darren's car screeched into the driveway. He jumped out in his expensive suit, rushing over to play the smooth-talking professional. He gave the officers a tight, cooperative smile and told them it was just a misunderstanding with his elderly father, assuring them he had the situation under control. I let them dig their hole deep. Then I stepped forward. I did not speak to my son or his wife. I addressed the officers directly. I pulled out my digital property tax records and the scanned copy of the deed I always keep securely backed up on my phone. I handed the officers my state identification. I stated clearly that I was the sole legal owner of the property, that I had not invited these people inside, and that they had used a stolen key to break in. The officers reviewed my documents, their expressions shifting from wary to stern. They turned to Darren and asked for his proof of residency. He stammered, his face turning pale, admitting he did not have any. The lead officer pointed at the moving truck and told Darren and Megan they were officially trespassing. He ordered the movers to put the sofa back on the truck and instructed my son and his wife to vacate the premises immediately or face arrest. Darren stood there completely humiliated in front of the entire neighborhood, his corporate pride shattered. The police escorted them off my property, watching closely as the moving truck backed out of my driveway in absolute defeat. The street finally went quiet. The spectacle was over, leaving a heavy, tense silence in its wake. I walked back inside my house and firmly locked the front door. The physical invasion had been stopped, but I needed to inspect the damage they had done while I was gone. I walked through the hallway, checking the walls and the floors until I reached my home office, the room Megan had so casually claimed for her imaginary nursery. I noticed immediately that my heavy oak desk had been shifted slightly to the left. A cold sense of dread settled in my stomach. I walked around the desk and looked at the wall safe, hidden behind a framed picture of me and Diane. The picture frame was skewed. I pulled it back and my blood ran ice cold. They were not just here to drop off furniture and force me out. The digital keypad on my safe was severely scratched, and the thick metal panel around the edges showed fresh, aggressive pry marks from a crowbar. They had tried to break into my secure files. This was not just an entitled property grab anymore. They were actively hunting for something deeply specific, and I was about to find out exactly how far my own son was willing to go. I left the damaged safe alone. The metal scars told me they were desperate, but Darren was never good with tools. He was a creature of digital habits. I walked to my desk, opened my laptop, and logged into my secure banking portal. Years ago, when Darren first moved into his own apartment, I gave him a secondary credit card attached to my primary account. I told him it was for absolute emergencies only, a medical crisis, a broken-down car, a genuine disaster. He had not used it in 5 years, but as the dashboard loaded on my screen, a glaring red alert flashed across the top. The available balance was decimated. $15,000 had been drained in the span of 72 hours. I clicked on the recent transactions, my jaw tightening with every line item. There were no hospital bills. There were no mechanic fees. There was a charge for $8,000 at an imported Italian furniture boutique, clearly the down payment for that velvet sofa and matching nursery set they had tried to force into my home earlier today. There were multiple charges at an elite maternity boutique, and right at the top, currently pending, was a massive charge for a VIP prenatal retreat at a luxury day spa downtown. My own son did not just try to steal my physical house. He was actively looting my financial reserves to fund a lifestyle he could not afford. The sheer disrespect washed over me, cold and calculating. I stared at the screen, letting the reality of the theft settle in. He thought he could outsmart me by attacking multiple fronts at once. If the house invasion failed, the financial drain would already be in motion. It was a cowardly, sneaky maneuver. I sat back in my heavy leather chair and stared at the glowing numbers on the screen. Growing up as a black man in a neighborhood where the system was designed to keep you broke, I learned early on that trust was an expensive luxury. When I started my contracting business, the banks did not want to lend to me. The suppliers demanded cash up front. I had to build my credit score with the same meticulous paranoid precision that I used to build houses. Every single dollar was tracked. Every financial risk was calculated and mitigated. Diane and I skipped vacations, drove beat-up trucks, and clipped coupons so we could amass a fortress of financial security. I taught Darren those same principles. I sat him at this very desk when he was a teenager, showing him how compound interest worked, how debt could enslave a man, and how a pristine financial reputation was his most vital shield in a world that would happily see him fail. I gave him that emergency card as a safety net, a fatherly promise that he would never truly fall. To see him weaponize that safety net to buy designer baby furniture and spa treatments for a woman who just tried to steal my house was not just a disappointment. It was a profound, unforgivable betrayal. It crossed the ultimate boundary. He was not acting out of desperation or a momentary lapse in judgment. He was operating with the arrogant assumption that my wealth was his personal playground. He thought I was just a senile old man who would eventually surrender, too tired to fight back, too desperate for a relationship with my future grandchild to cut off the cash flow. He mistook my quiet nature for weakness. He mistook my fatherly patience for stupidity. I closed my laptop. The sorrow I felt the night before was completely gone, burned away by a cold, sharp clarity. Darren was no longer acting like a son. He was acting like a parasite, and it was time to amputate. I refused to let anyone dismantle the legacy Diane and I had bled for. Blood relation or not, a thief is a thief. My tolerance for his delusions of grandeur had completely vanished. I did not call him to demand an explanation. I did not send an angry text message. I grabbed my coat and drove directly to the main branch of my bank. I did not use the phone line because I wanted this handled with absolute immediate authority. I walked into the manager office, a man who had handled my accounts for 15 years, and instructed him to lock down everything. I canceled the secondary card immediately. I flagged every single transaction from the past 72 hours as unauthorized and initiated a formal fraud investigation. I froze the connected checking accounts and changed every password, security question, and authorization protocol on my profile. I severed the financial umbilical cord with a few strokes of a keyboard. At that exact moment across town, Megan was lounging in a plush robe at a luxury day spa. According to the timeline I later pieced together, she had invited 3 of her wealthy friends for a full day of prenatal massages, champagne facials, and expensive catered lunches, all on my dime. She was holding court, playing the role of the affluent, successful, soon-to-be mother. When the spa concierge presented her with the final bill for over $2,000, Megan confidently handed over the shiny platinum card with my account number tied to it. The concierge swiped it, declined. Megan laughed it off as a simple machine error, assuring her friends it was just a bank security glitch. She demanded the concierge run it again, her voice taking on that familiar, entitled edge. The concierge typed in the numbers manually. Declined. A fraud alert instantly popped up on the spa terminal, instructing the merchant to confiscate the card. The concierge, maintaining a polite but firm tone, informed Megan that the card was reported stolen and requested an alternative form of payment. Megan stood there in her expensive robe, her face burning crimson, completely humiliated in front of the very women she was trying to impress. She had no other cards with that kind of limit. She had to beg her friends to split the massive bill. The illusion she had carefully crafted for her social circle shattered in an instant. She was forced to admit she could not cover her own extravagant tab, exposing the harsh truth behind her fake wealth. I was just pulling my truck back into my driveway when my cell phone started vibrating uncontrollably in the cup holder. It was Darren. The moment I answered, he did not even say hello. He was practically hyperventilating, screaming through the speaker with a rage I had never heard from him before. He yelled that I had publicly humiliated his wife, that her friends were laughing at her, and that I was a petty, vindictive monster for cutting off their card without warning. He demanded I call the bank immediately to clear the fraud alert and pay for the spa bill. I listened to his frantic, entitled screaming without saying a single word. My silence only fueled his panic. In his desperate attempt to regain the upper hand, he deployed the only weapon he thought he had left. He hissed into the phone, his voice dripping with venom. "You made a massive mistake today, old man. You embarrassed my wife like this, and I promise you will never, ever get to look at this child. You will die alone in that big, empty house, and you will never see your grandchild." I did not reply to his empty threats. I hung up the phone and blocked his number entirely. Silence was the only appropriate response to a tantrum of that magnitude. But the silence did not last long. 2 days later, I received a voicemail from a number I rarely saw on my screen. It was Tom Megan's father. He used a jovial, overly familiar tone, inviting me to his exclusive suburban golf club for lunch. He said it was time for the grown-ups to sit down and smooth over this little family misunderstanding. I knew exactly what this was. Tom and his wife Nancy considered themselves upper-crust society, the kind of people who hid their prejudice behind polite smiles and pastel polo shirts. They thought they could summon the retired black contractor to their turf, dazzle me with their country club membership, and intimidate me into submission. I put on my best tailored suit, the charcoal gray one Diane always loved, and drove to the club. The valet tried to direct my truck to the back parking lot, but I tossed him a crisp tip and parked it right in front of the main clubhouse doors. I walked into the dining room with my head held high. The air conditioning was freezing, a stark contrast to the burning entitlement radiating from the room. Tom and Nancy were already seated at a prime table overlooking the 18th hole. Tom stood up, flashing a practiced politician's smile, while Nancy offered a tight, uncomfortable nod. They were dressed in pristine golf attire, exuding an air of manufactured superiority. I sat down across from them, ordering nothing but a glass of sparkling water from the waiter. I did not exchange pleasantries. I did not ask about their golf game or the weather. I stared at them with cold, unwavering focus and waited for them to lay their cards on the table. Tom cleared his throat, adjusting the collar of his expensive-looking shirt. He launched into a condescending monologue about how difficult it can be for people of my background to manage significant assets as they get older. He used all the classic microaggressions, speaking slowly and deliberately, avoiding direct words like race or class, but laying the implications on incredibly thick. He suggested that managing a 4-bedroom property and maintaining financial portfolios was simply too overwhelming for a man of my age and history. He used terms like cognitive decline and legacy protection while looking at me like I was a helpless charity case. Nancy chimed in, swirling her mimosa, adding that Darren and Megan were simply trying to relieve my burden. Then came the ultimate insult. Tom leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and presented his grand solution. He proposed a private off-market sale. He offered to buy my house for a flat cash sum, a number so insultingly low it was barely a quarter of the property's actual market value. He framed this brazen robbery as a generous favor. He claimed he was stepping in to protect his future grandchild from housing instability, ensuring the baby had a proper foundation, because I was clearly struggling to provide one. He actually had the audacity to suggest that by taking the house off my hands, he was saving me from inevitable financial ruin. I sat there, listening to this mediocre man try to swindle me out of my life's work. My mind flashed back to the late 70s. While Tom was likely riding his father's coattails through college, I was working double shifts on dangerous construction sites, fighting for fair wages and dealing with suppliers who refused to shake my hand. I built my wealth through grueling, relentless labor. I managed my money with flawless precision because I knew society would never give me a second chance if I failed. Now this man with his artificial country club tan was sitting across from me, trying to manipulate me out of my home, using fake concern for a grandchild as his weapon. He looked at me expectantly, waiting for me to eagerly accept his pathetic bailout. I watched Nancy nod in agreement, her posture radiating an unwarranted arrogance. They honestly believed I was an uneducated laborer who would be dazzled by a minor cash offer from a supposedly superior savior. I did not raise my voice. I simply picked up my glass of sparkling water, took a slow sip, and set it down precisely on the coaster. I looked at Tom's wrist resting so proudly on the table. "Tom," I said smoothly, "that is a very striking watch. An Oyster Perpetual, correct?" He puffed out his chest, smiling arrogantly, and confirmed it was. I leaned in just a fraction. It is a shame the sweeping motion of the second hand stutters. Rolex uses a perpetual mechanical movement. Yours ticks like a cheap quartz imitation. The magnification on the date window is also entirely wrong, and the bezel alignment is off by 2 millimeters. It is a decent replica, but a fake nonetheless. Tom's face went completely pale. He quickly pulled his arm off the table, hiding his wrist under the white tablecloth. Before Nancy could gasp in defense of her husband, I turned my gaze to the designer handbag resting proudly on the empty chair beside her. "And Nancy," I continued, my tone pleasant but razor sharp, "that is a beautiful seasonal tote. It is quite a coincidence that the return shipping tag from a luxury leasing website is still tucked inside the front pocket zipper. I saw you trying to push it out of sight when I walked up to the table." Nancy turned a brilliant shade of crimson, her hand instinctively flying to cover the expensive bag. The illusion of their vast generational wealth shattered in less than 30 seconds. You see, I told them, resting my hands firmly on the table. I spent 40 years evaluating building materials, identifying structural flaws, and spotting cheap facades. You two are standing on a crumbling foundation. You came here to steal my house for pennies because you are terrified your daughter is going to ask you for a financial bailout you absolutely cannot afford. You want my property to cover up your own bankruptcy. I reached into my wallet, pulled out a crisp $20 bill, and dropped it onto the table. That covers my water and whatever cheap drinks you are nursing. Let me make this incredibly clear. My house is not a refugee camp for your daughter's failures. Do not ever contact me again. I stood up from the table, leaving them speechless and utterly humiliated in the middle of their precious dining room. I walked out of the country club with the same steady, deliberate pace I had entered with. I felt a fleeting sense of victory, knowing I had exposed their hollow reality. I thought dismantling their pride would force them to retreat back into their miserable, debt-ridden lives. I underestimated the sheer desperation of cornered animals. Their humiliation did not breed surrender. It bred a dangerous, reckless malice. 3 days later, the doorbell rang. I opened the door to find a process server standing on my porch. He handed me a thick manila envelope and walked away without a single word. I opened it right there in the hallway. It was a formal court summons. Tom, Nancy, and Darren had banded together to file a legal petition for an emergency conservatorship over my estate. They had submitted sworn affidavits falsely claiming I was suffering from severe paranoia, violent outbursts, and rapid onset dementia. They were legally asking a judge to strip me of my basic human rights, seize control of my bank accounts, and force me out of my home. They wanted to turn me into a ward of the state, a prisoner in my own life, all so they could liquidate my assets. The financial battle was over. This was a war for my freedom. I stood in my hallway staring at the legal papers, trembling slightly in my hands. The audacity of the lies printed on those official court documents was staggering. According to the sworn statement signed by my own son, I was a deeply unstable, violent man who had suffered a complete psychotic break. The primary piece of evidence for this supposed rapid onset dementia was a highly fabricated account of the incident with the moving truck. Megan had written a tearful affidavit claiming I had lunged at her screaming paranoid delusions and ruthlessly kicked a defenseless pregnant woman onto the curb. She painted herself as a terrified victim trying to care for a sick old man, while I was depicted as a dangerous threat to society who needed immediate institutionalization. They were asking the court to grant Darren full control over my medical decisions, my property, and every single cent to my name. They wanted the authority to sell my house out from under me to pay for my so-called specialized psychiatric care. The sheer level of coordination required to fabricate these legal documents meant they had been planning this ambush long before that dinner at the restaurant. They had weaponized the legal system to bypass my locked doors and frozen bank accounts. This was not just a greedy grab for real estate anymore. It was a calculated assassination of my character, my sanity, and my legacy. If a judge believed their carefully constructed lies, I would be legally erased. I would be stripped of my autonomy and locked away in a facility while they liquidated my life work to fund their delusions of grandeur. The psychological warfare started immediately after the summons was delivered. My phone began ringing nonstop, hour after hour. It was Darren leaving voicemail after voicemail, shifting wildly between fake concern and outright threats. In one message, he would use a soft, pleading voice, begging me to surrender quietly and let them help me. In the next, his tone would turn vicious, promising that if I fought the conservatorship, he would make sure the judge locked me in a miserable state-run mental ward where I would rot forgotten. Megan left messages too, crying into the receiver, telling me to stop being difficult for the sake of the baby. They wanted me to panic. They wanted me to call them back, scream at them, and provide them with recorded evidence of an erratic, volatile old man. I did not give them a single syllable. I kept my mouth shut, saved every voicemail, and forwarded everything to a secure cloud drive. I knew that reacting with anger was exactly the trap they had set. Growing up in my era, a black man showing anger was always immediately labeled as dangerous. I was not going to let them use my justified rage as a weapon against my freedom. Instead of screaming into a phone, I picked up my keys and drove downtown to a high-rise office building. I walked into the pristine, intimidating reception area of Mitchell & Associates. Mr. Mitchell was a seasoned, ruthless litigator who had successfully defended my contracting business against a massive, fraudulent corporate lawsuit 20 years ago. He was a shark in a tailored suit, a man who viewed courtrooms not as places of justice but as battlefields where the most prepared warrior takes all. I sat across his massive mahogany desk and dropped the conservatorship summons right in the center. I did not ask him to play nice. I did not ask for a gentle family mediation. I told him my son and his in-laws were trying to bury me alive, and I wanted to orchestrate a legal counteroffensive so devastating that they would never recover. Mr. Mitchell read the affidavits, a cold, predatory smile slowly spreading across his face. He leaned back in his leather chair, tapped his gold pen on the desk, and told me that defending against the petition was only half the battle. If we wanted to destroy them, we had to find out exactly why they were suddenly so desperate for cash. We did not waste time drafting defensive statements or begging the court for leniency. We went entirely on the offensive. Mr. Mitchell immediately brought in a high-end private investigator, an ex-federal agent who specialized in forensic accounting and asset tracking. I signed a blank check for his retainer and gave him one clear directive. I wanted every single financial record, tax return, credit history, and hidden debt belonging to Darren, Megan, Tom, and Nancy exposed to the absolute bare minimum. While my son and his wife were busy preparing to testify about my supposed mental deterioration, my legal team was quietly ripping their lives apart on a spreadsheet. I continued to play the role of the terrified, silent old man. I let Darren leave his threatening voicemails. I let Megan post vague, victimizing quotes on her social media pages about dealing with toxic, mentally ill family members. They were so confident in their offensive strategy that they completely ignored their exposed flanks. Mr. Mitchell filed a standard delay motion for the conservatorship hearing, buying the investigator a full week to dig through the digital trash. I sat in my kitchen every night drinking black coffee, listening to Darren's voicemails and letting his arrogance fuel my patience. He honestly believed he had outsmarted a man who had survived decades of institutional racism, economic recessions, and cutthroat business rivals. He thought a few fabricated doctor notes and some fake tears from his wife would be enough to break me. But he failed to realize that the very money he was trying to steal from me was actively funding the investigation that would ruin him. I was using my wealth to buy the ultimate truth. On the 5th day of our counter-operation, I received a secure encrypted email from Mr. Mitchell. The subject line simply read, "Target profiles completed." I drove back down to his office, my heart steady and my mind clear. I was ready to see whatever ugly reality had pushed my son to commit such an unforgivable betrayal. Mr. Mitchell was not smiling when I walked into his office this time. He was sitting behind his desk, staring grimly at a thick-bound dossier. He pushed the heavy file across the mahogany wood toward me. He told me the investigator had struck gold, but warned me that what I was about to read would permanently alter my understanding of my son's life. I opened the cover, my eyes scanning the heavily highlighted financial reports, credit scores, and legal notices. A cold, heavy chill crept up my spine. The affluent, successful corporate lifestyle Darren and Megan constantly bragged about was a complete fabricated mirage. They were not just experiencing a temporary cash flow problem. They were standing at the edge of absolute financial ruin. My son was drowning in a catastrophic ocean of high-interest debt, hidden loans, and desperate financial maneuvers. As I turned the page to the summary of his employment history and current housing status, the real horrifying motive behind their desperate attempt to declare me legally incompetent finally stared me right in the face. I stared at the bold red text on the investigator report, my stomach turning to lead. Darren was not the successful corporate manager he had been pretending to be. According to the internal company documents secured by the investigator, my son had been unceremoniously fired 4 months ago. He was not just laid off due to company downsizing or budget cuts. He had been caught actively embezzling corporate funds to cover his rapidly mounting personal expenses. His former employer had allowed him to quietly resign to avoid a messy public scandal, but his career in that lucrative industry was permanently over. That was just the beginning of the nightmare. I flipped to the next page, which detailed his current housing situation. The luxury downtown apartment Megan constantly bragged about on social media, the one with the skyline views, the rooftop pool, and the 24-hour concierge service, was a complete financial sinkhole. They were exactly 5 months behind on their rent. Attached to the financial breakdown was a formal, legally binding eviction notice filed by the property management group. The document confirmed that if they did not pay the massive arrears in full within the next 14 days, the local sheriff department would physically remove them and their belongings from the premises. The truth hit me with the force of a freight train. The sudden aggressive demand for my 4-bedroom house had absolutely nothing to do with making space for a new baby. The calculated outrage at the restaurant, the moving truck showing up at my front door, the stolen spare key, and the fraudulent petition to have me declared legally incompetent, all of it was an act of pure, unadulterated desperation. They were not trying to upgrade their lifestyle. They were trying to steal my home because they were quite literally about to be thrown out onto the street. The sheer depravity of their scheme settled heavily over me. My own flesh and blood had sat across from me at a fancy dinner wearing a suit bought with stolen money and tried to manipulate me out of the foundation I built with my bare hands. He used the emotional leverage of an unborn child to mask the fact that he was a failed, disgraced thief who could no longer provide a roof over his family. This was the absolute peak of Darren moral corruption. Growing up, I had warned him about the dangers of living beyond his means. I had taught him that a man's true worth is not measured by the zip code of his apartment or the brand of his wife's clothing, but by his integrity and his ability to honor his debts. He ignored every single lesson I ever taught him. He chose the illusion of wealth over the reality of hard work. And when that illusion finally collapsed, instead of coming to me as a son asking for guidance or a temporary lifeline, he chose to treat me like a disposable asset. He decided that destroying my sanity, stripping me of my civil rights, and locking me in a psychiatric facility was a perfectly acceptable price to pay to cover up his own humiliating failures. I looked across the desk at Mr. Mitchell. The lawyer remained completely silent, giving me the space to process the magnitude of the betrayal. He knew just as well as I did that this changed the entire landscape of our legal battle. Darren and Megan were cornered animals. They had no income, no credit, and no backup plan. That made them incredibly dangerous, but it also made them entirely predictable. They thought they were hunting a vulnerable old man, but they had blindly walked into a trap of their own making. I did not feel pity. The protective fatherly instinct that usually softened my heart had been completely burned away by their malice. If they wanted to play a ruthless game of real estate and legal manipulation, I was going to show them how a master builder dismantles a structure from the inside out. I closed the dossier and slid it back across the desk. I told Mr. Mitchell that defending the conservatorship was no longer enough. I wanted to own their problem. Mr. Mitchell leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with the predatory focus of a seasoned litigator. I laid out my strategy. I did not want to simply present these documents in family court to prove Darren was an unfit conservator. That would only preserve my freedom. I wanted to establish absolute dominance over their immediate future. I instructed Mr. Mitchell to immediately register an anonymous limited liability company under a highly generic corporate name. I authorized him to use a significant portion of my liquid savings to fund this new corporate entity. With the LLC legally established and shielded by strict layers of corporate privacy, Mr. Mitchell reached out directly to the property management group handling Darren Luxury Apartment. Landlords dealing with high-value evictions are often eager to avoid the lengthy, expensive, and messy process of a forced sheriff removal. They want to cut their losses and clear their ledgers as quickly as possible. My lawyer made them a highly lucrative, entirely confidential offer. My anonymous LLC would purchase the entirety of Darren rental debt up front in cash. In exchange, the property management group would legally transfer the collection rights and the active eviction order directly to my company. It took less than 48 hours of aggressive legal maneuvering and wire transfers to finalize the paperwork. The landlord was thrilled to wash their hands of the delinquent tenants and recover their lost income. Darren and Megan had absolutely no idea that the corporate entity holding their massive debt and their impending eviction notice was now fully controlled by the very man they were trying to lock in a mental institution. I had legally bought their desperation. I now held the absolute power to dictate exactly when and how they would lose their home. I walked out of Mr. Mitchell's office feeling a profound, chilling sense of control. The defensive phase of this war was officially over. I was holding the ultimate trump card, and I was going to wait for the absolute perfect moment to play it for maximum impact. But while I was quietly securing my financial guillotine, Megan launched a vicious, highly public attack of her own. I woke up the next morning to an alarming phone call from a fellow church member. They told me I needed to check the internet immediately. I logged onto my computer and found a video Megan had posted the night before. It was already going viral across local community groups and neighborhood message boards. She sat in front of the camera wearing an oversized sweater, clutching a tissue and sobbing uncontrollably. She looked directly into the lens and spun a highly produced, devastatingly manipulative story. She claimed that she and her husband were being cruelly targeted and abused by a hateful, bigoted father-in-law. She weaponized her identity as a white woman carrying a mixed-race child, explicitly accusing me of reverse racism. She tearfully alleged that I despised her solely because of her race and that I had violently kicked her out of my home to ensure her baby would be born on the streets. She completely omitted the stolen keys, the uninvited moving truck, and the fraudulent conservatorship. The comments section was a terrifying explosion of outrage. Strangers from my own neighborhood were calling for my arrest, sharing my home address, and demanding justice for the poor, oppressed pregnant woman. The digital mob had been unleashed, and the court of public opinion was rapidly turning against me. The digital mob did not wait for the facts. Within 24 hours of Megan uploading her tearful, expertly manipulated video, my quiet suburban life was completely shattered. My phone battery drained continuously from the sheer volume of notifications, hateful messages, and unhinged threats from complete strangers who had never even met me. They flooded the neighborhood community pages, calling me a bitter, racist old man who despised his own unborn grandchild. They shared photos of my house, the very house I built with my own 2 hands, demanding that social services step in and remove me from the property for my own good. When I walked out to my driveway the next morning to retrieve my newspaper, the atmosphere in my neighborhood had visibly shifted. Cars slowed down as they passed my property, the drivers glaring at me through their windows with open disgust. Mrs. Gable, a woman I had lived across the street from for 20 years and whose roof I had repaired for free after a severe winter storm, quickly turned her head and hurried inside her house when I waved at her. The isolation was immediate, heavy, and suffocating. I was suddenly an outcast in the very community I had spent decades helping to build. A 3-minute performance of fake, weaponized tears had managed to erase 40 years of my pristine reputation. Megan knew exactly what she was doing. She understood that society is primed to instinctively protect a weeping, seemingly vulnerable pregnant woman, and she used that dangerous inherent bias to paint a massive target squarely on my back. The worst part was not the vitriol from anonymous strangers on the internet. It was the absolute smug satisfaction radiating from my son. Later that afternoon, Darren left a gloating voicemail on my phone. He did not sound panicked or desperate anymore. He sounded triumphant, drunk on the false power of viral sympathy. He chuckled into the receiver, telling me that the court of public opinion had already delivered its verdict. He boasted that I could not fight the entire internet, and that the judge overseeing our impending conservatorship hearing would undoubtedly see the public outrage as undeniable proof of my instability. He offered me one final arrogant chance to surrender the house deed quietly before they took their smear campaign to the local news stations. Listening to his arrogant voice, a profound realization washed over me. I realized how terrifyingly fast a well-crafted lie can kill a man's honor. As a black contractor starting out in the late 70s, I had to work 10 times harder than my white counterparts just to be considered legitimate. I spent my entire adult life meticulously guarding my character, paying every vendor on time, keeping my word on every handshake, and proving my worth every single day. I built a bulletproof reputation because I knew that in this world my integrity was the only currency that could not be stripped away from me. Yet my own son and his wife were casually destroying that lifetime of honor to cover up their own pathetic financial failures. They were willing to let strangers send me death threats just so they could steal my real estate. They felt invincible behind their glowing smartphone screens, convinced that their digital mob gave them absolute power. But they fundamentally misunderstood how true influence works in the real world. Internet outrage burns bright and fast, but it is ultimately hollow. Genuine reputation is rooted deep in the community, built on decades of face-to-face relationships, mutual respect, and quiet actions. I knew exactly how to leverage my real-world equity to dismantle their virtual lies. I did not need to record a reactionary video shout into a camera or argue with anonymous trolls in a comment section. I needed to speak directly to the people who actually controlled the narrative in my neighborhood. I picked up my phone and made 2 very specific phone calls. I invited Pastor Evans, the head of the local congregation I had attended for 30 years, and Mrs. Gable, the president of our neighborhood watch association, over for a quiet afternoon tea. They accepted with hesitant, uncomfortable tones, clearly torn between their long-standing respect for me and the scandalous rumors swirling online. When they arrived at my home, I welcomed them with the same calm, gracious hospitality Diane and I had always shown. We sat in the living room, surrounded by the quiet dignity of my home. I did not immediately bring up the viral video or launch into a defensive, angry rant. Instead, I poured the tea, asked about their families, and let the comfortable familiarity of our shared history ease the heavy tension in the room. Then I executed my strategy. I stood up, excusing myself to the kitchen to fetch a plate of warm pastries. I intentionally left the thick-bound legal dossier Mr. Mitchell had prepared sitting squarely in the center of the mahogany coffee table. I had meticulously arranged the documents so that the most damning evidence was face up and impossible to ignore. Right on top was the official police report detailing Darren and Megan's unauthorized break-in and their attempt to pry open my safe. Directly beneath that was the formal eviction notice for their luxury apartment, boldly highlighting their 5 months of unpaid rent. And right beside it lay the corporate termination letter exposing Darren's embezzlement from his former employer. I stayed in the kitchen for exactly 4 minutes. I took my time placing the pastries on a platter, allowing human nature to take its course. When I returned, the atmosphere in the living room had completely transformed. Pastor Evans was staring at the documents, his face pale with shock. Mrs. Gable looked absolutely mortified, her eyes wide as she processed the undeniable printed truth. I set the pastries down, offered a sad, weary sigh, and apologized for leaving my private legal burdens out in the open. I quietly confessed that my son was in deep financial trouble and was trying to force me out of my home to cover his debts using the false pregnancy narrative to manipulate the public. The effect was instantaneous. The gossip network of a church and a neighborhood watch operates with far more efficiency and credibility than any social media platform. Within 48 hours, the truth ripped through our community. The pastors and the neighbors mobilized, sharing the actual facts with everyone they knew. The narrative flipped violently. The comments on Megan's video suddenly shifted from blind support to fierce local backlash, with people calling out her lies, exposing Darren's eviction, and demanding she take the deceitful video down. The sudden spectacular collapse of their public smear campaign sent Darren into a dangerous, uncontrolled downward spiral. He realized that not only had his social leverage evaporated, but his shameful financial ruin and his corporate embezzlement were now common knowledge among the people who used to respect him. His carefully crafted illusion of wealth and success was entirely dead. That night, shortly after 2 a.m, the heavy, oppressive silence of my neighborhood was shattered by the violent, terrifying sound of breaking glass. I bolted upright in my bed, my heart hammering against my ribs. I moved quickly to the window and peered through the blinds. Standing in my driveway, illuminated by the harsh glow of the street lamp, was my son. He was swaying heavily, clearly intoxicated, his face twisted in an ugly mask of pure, unhinged rage. In his hands, he gripped a solid aluminum baseball bat. He raised it high above his head and brought it crashing down onto the windshield of my parked truck, sending shards of safety glass exploding into the dark driveway. He was screaming my name into the quiet night, his voice echoing off the houses, demanding I come outside and face him. The sharp, violent crunch of safety glass shattering in the dead of night echoed like a gunshot. I stood by my bedroom window looking down at the driveway. Darren took another wild, uncoordinated swing with the solid aluminum baseball bat, bringing it down hard on the hood of my truck. That truck was not just a vehicle. It was the very first brand new asset I bought in cash after landing my first major municipal contracting job. The heavy thud of metal denting under his drunken rage made my jaw clench. He stumbled backward, struggling to keep his balance on the paved concrete. His expensive suit jacket was gone. His dress shirt was untucked and heavily stained, and he was screaming my name with a raw, guttural desperation. He roared into the quiet suburban street, demanding I open the door, demanding I give him the money he felt entitled to. He slurred his words, cursing me for exposing his eviction and his corporate embezzlement to the church and the neighborhood watch. He yelled that I had ruined his life, that I had humiliated his pregnant wife, and that I owed him my 4-bedroom house as compensation for his misery. The sheer volume of his tantrum was deafening. Lights flickered on in the houses next door. I could see the silhouette of Mrs. Gable standing behind her curtains, no doubt dialing the police, but I did not want the police to intervene just yet. I needed to handle this confrontation on my own terms. I grabbed my heavy winter coat, slipped my arms into the sleeves, and unlocked the deadbolts on my front door. I stepped out onto the porch, bathed in the harsh yellow glow of the security light. The moment the heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, Darren snapped his attention toward the porch. He dropped the baseball bat onto the driveway with a loud metallic clatter and charged up the walkway. He cleared the concrete steps in 2 massive strides, his face twisted in a mask of pure, intoxicated fury. Before I could even brace my stance, he lunged forward and grabbed the thick fabric of my coat with both hands. He shoved me hard against the brick facade of my own house. The heavy impact knocked the breath from my lungs for a brief second. Darren leaned in his face inches from mine. The overwhelming stench of cheap whiskey and sour sweat radiated off him, a disgusting contrast to the polished corporate executive he always pretended to be. He tightened his grip on my collar, his knuckles white, his eyes bloodshot and erratic. He hissed through his teeth, threatening to tear my life apart if I did not sign over the property deed by sunrise. The tension on that porch was thick enough to cut with a knife. Any neighbor watching from their window would have assumed a brutal physical fight was about to erupt. My instincts, honed from decades of working on rough construction sites where physical altercations were common, screamed at me to fight back. Even at 69 years old, I possessed the heavy, calloused strength of a man who had spent his life lifting lumber and pouring concrete. I could have easily swept his legs, pinned him against the porch railing, and broken his arrogant jaw. My fists clenched tightly at my sides, every muscle in my body coiled and ready to strike. It would have been incredibly satisfying to physically discipline the arrogant thief who was currently pinning me against my own house. But I forced my hands to remain open. I forced my muscles to relax. I knew that engaging in a physical brawl with my son would give his lawyers exactly the ammunition they needed. If I laid a single hand on him, Megan would immediately claim I was a violent, unstable old man having a psychotic episode. I refused to hand them that victory. I needed him to dig his grave with his own words. I stared directly into his bloodshot eyes, completely unbothered by his aggressive posturing. I did not struggle against his grip. Instead, I let a cold, mocking smile spread across my face. What my son did not know was that just 48 hours ago, I had hired a professional security firm to install state-of-the-art, high-definition surveillance cameras around the entire perimeter of my property. Hidden perfectly beneath the eaves of the porch roof, a discreet lens was capturing incredibly clear video in pristine 4K resolution. More importantly, it was equipped with a highly sensitive directional microphone that was currently recording every single syllable spoken on that porch. I leaned my head back against the brick wall and spoke in a calm, steady, deliberately provocative tone. "Are you going to beat me to death for my real estate, Darren? Is that how desperate you are because you got fired for stealing?" I watched the muscle in his jaw twitch violently. I pushed harder, aiming straight for his fragile ego. "You smashed my truck because you cannot afford your own rent. You are a complete failure. You think grabbing an old man by the collar makes you powerful. You are nothing but a broke, pathetic beggar trying to steal from his own father." The calculated insult worked flawlessly. Darren completely lost his temper. His grip on my coat tightened so much the fabric began to tear. He shook me violently against the wall, his face contorted in pure malice. He roared into the night air, his voice echoing perfectly into the hidden microphone above us. "I will take everything from you. I will take this house. I will drain your bank accounts, and I will take every single penny you have left. If you do not sign those papers, I will forge them myself. I will tell the judge you are completely insane. I will take everything, even if I have to lock you in a psych ward to do it." He spit the words out with absolute, undeniable clarity. It was a perfect, unfiltered confession of his entire fraudulent scheme. I had successfully baited him into admitting his exact intent to falsely imprison me for financial gain. I smiled again, a genuine smile of victory, and simply told him to let go of my coat. The distant wail of approaching police sirens finally pierced the night air. The sound snapped Darren out of his drunken, violent trance. He let go of my coat, stumbling backward down the porch steps, suddenly realizing the neighbors had actually called the authorities. He scrambled down the driveway, completely ignoring his baseball bat, and ran off into the darkness just before 2 patrol cars turned the corner. The officers arrived, assessed the shattered glass on my truck, and asked if I wanted to press criminal charges for vandalism. I politely declined, citing it as a simple family misunderstanding. I did not want Darren arrested for a minor property crime. I wanted him to feel safe enough to proceed with his conservatorship fraud, which was a massive federal felony. As soon as the police left, I downloaded the pristine video and audio file from my security app and forwarded it directly to Mr. Mitchell. I was absolutely certain that this recording was the silver bullet. I believed that providing the court with crystal clear evidence of my son admitting to a fabricated psychiatric plot would instantly terminate their entire legal campaign. I was wrong. 3 days later, a certified letter arrived in my mailbox directly from the county family court. Mr. Mitchell called me to explain the frustrating reality of the legal system. He warned me that judges handling elder law are extremely conservative. because the conservatorship request was formally backed by sworn affidavits from Darren Megan and her parents, the court viewed the video of a drunken argument as mere family drama. The judge ruled that legal procedure must be followed strictly. The letter in my hand was a mandatory court order. I was officially compelled to attend a comprehensive psychological evaluation overseen by a court-appointed psychiatric specialist. If I failed to attend, I would be held in contempt of court, and Darren would be granted temporary control of my estate by default. The trap I had set worked perfectly, yet the system still demanded I prove my sanity. The waiting room of Dr. Arthur Sterling was oppressively sterile, bathed in harsh fluorescent light that seemed designed to induce a headache. I sat in a rigid leather chair, my hands resting calmly on my knees, waiting for the court-appointed psychiatric specialist to call my name. When I was finally ushered into his inner office, the doctor did not greet me with the neutral professional courtesy one would expect from an impartial medical examiner. He sat behind a massive glass desk, peering at me over the rim of his designer glasses with a smug, predetermined judgment already locked into his eyes. Doctor. Sterling began the evaluation not with standard cognitive baseline tests, but with a barrage of highly aggressive, manipulative questions explicitly engineered to corner me. He leaned forward, his pen tapping a frantic rhythm on his legal pad, and asked why I harbored such violent, paranoid delusions against my own flesh and blood. He twisted the events of the past few weeks with malicious precision. When I calmly explained that my son had shattered the windshield of my truck with a baseball bat, Dr. Sterling patronizingly interrupted me. He claimed that according to the sworn affidavits provided by my family, I had actually smashed my own vehicle in a state of severe dementia-induced confusion, and that Darren was simply trying to disarm me for my own safety. He asked me what year it was, then immediately talked over me before I could answer, demanding to know why I had aggressively kicked a vulnerable pregnant woman out of my home. Every single inquiry was a linguistic trap. If I raised my voice to defend my honor, he would check the box for emotional volatility. If I remained completely silent, he would document cognitive unresponsiveness. He was actively trying to manufacture a medical diagnosis of insanity right in front of my eyes. The psychological pressure in that room was suffocating. I realized very quickly that this was not a fair, objective medical assessment ordered by a blind justice system. This doctor was a hired gun, a mercenary in a white coat, operating as a direct extension of my son and his in-laws. The stakes were incredibly high, resting on the razor-thin edge of my composure. One miscalculated response, one moment of justified anger, or one exhausted sigh would be legally codified as proof of a deteriorating mind. A single signature from this compromised physician would grant a judge the medical justification needed to strip away my civil liberties. My entire life, the contracting business I built from nothing, the wealth I meticulously saved, and the 4-bedroom house Diane and I turned into a home would instantly be handed over to the very people trying to destroy me. I felt the familiar heavy weight of being an older black man navigating a systemic structure that historically assumes our guilt and our incompetence. I knew that the medical system harbored the same dangerous biases as the courtrooms. I had to remain an impenetrable fortress of stoicism. Dr. Sterling continued his assault, attempting to disorient me by bringing up the exact date of Diane passing, rapidly firing overlapping questions about my grief, my financial decisions, and my daily routines. He wanted me to break down. He wanted a tear, a tremor, or a shout. I stared directly into his eyes, slowing my breathing, calculating the exact timing of my responses. I gave him nothing but concise, factual, legally bulletproof answers. But internal discipline was only a temporary shield against a rigged game. I needed a decisive offensive strike to permanently shatter the legitimacy of this fraudulent evaluation. Right as Dr. Sterling arrogantly informed me that my defensive posture was highly indicative of paranoia, the heavy oak door of his private office swung wide open. I did not flinch, but the doctor jumped in his seat. Mr. Mitchell strode into the room with the commanding lethal presence of an apex predator. He was not alone. Flanking my attorney were 3 incredibly distinguished board-certified psychiatrists, including the former head of neurology at the State Medical University. These were the absolute highest-ranking independent medical professionals in the region, a specialized medical board I had personally funded through my anonymous LLC precisely for this exact moment. Doctor. Sterling immediately stood up, his face flushing with indignation, shouting that this was a closed court-mandated evaluation and demanding that they leave his private practice at once. Mr. Mitchell did not even blink. He walked directly up to the glass desk and slammed a thick, glossy financial dossier right on top of Dr. Sterling's notepad. Mr. Mitchell informed him, his voice dripping with legal menace, that the independent board standing in the room had already conducted a comprehensive multi-hour psychological evaluation of my mental state earlier that week entirely legally and had certified me as possessing exceptional cognitive function. Then Mr. Mitchell played his killing stroke. He opened the dossier and pointed a long, steady finger at a highlighted bank routing document. He loudly announced that his forensic investigator had tracked a very specific offshore wire transfer made exactly 48 hours prior. The document showed a direct deposit of $10,000 wired into a shell company owned by Dr. Sterling. The name on the originating account was Nancy, using her maiden name in a pathetic attempt to hide the paper trail. Mr. Mitchell looked the terrified doctor dead in the eye and promised to submit this undeniable proof of medical bribery and perjury to the State Medical Licensing Board before the sun went down. Dr. Sterling collapsed back into his chair, the color draining completely from his face, realizing his career was instantly over. The entire fraudulent petition for conservatorship died right there in that sterile office. With their paid medical expert completely neutralized by undeniable proof of bribery, Darren and Megan had absolutely no legal foundation left to stand on. Mr. Mitchell and I walked out of the clinic and stepped into the crisp afternoon air, having successfully defended my freedom and entirely dismantled their legal assault. But the war was evolving faster than we anticipated. As we reached my truck, Mr. Mitchell's encrypted cell phone began to ring aggressively. He answered, listening intently for nearly a minute while his expression hardened into a look of absolute steel. He hung up the phone and turned to me, his eyes sharp and focused. The private investigator had just intercepted a series of frantic, panicked communications. Tom and Nancy had received word that their bribed doctor was compromised and the conservatorship plan had imploded. They knew the legal backlash was going to hit them like a tidal wave. According to the investigator, the affluent in-laws were currently in a state of complete hysteria. They were actively liquidating every single asset they could get their hands on, selling off their vehicles below market value, draining their remaining retirement funds and packing their bags. They were not just preparing for a lawsuit. They were trying to flee the state, desperate to escape the massive, dangerous gambling debts they owed to very unforgiving people. Mr. Mitchell and I did not celebrate our victory at the psychiatric clinic. We immediately returned to his secure downtown office to review the latest encrypted files sent over by our private investigator. The investigator had been meticulously tracking the digital footprints of Tom and Nancy's frantic attempts to liquidate their assets, but he stumbled upon a much darker financial anomaly hidden deep within the banking records. He pulled up the detailed transaction history from the secondary credit card Darren had stolen from my home office. When I initially saw the $15,000 drained from my account, I assumed it had all gone toward the imported Italian velvet sofa and Megan's luxury spa retreat. I was completely wrong. The investigator uncovered the true hidden destination of the bulk of those stolen funds. Darren had executed a massive high-fee cash advance against my credit limit, routing the money through a complex series of untraceable digital payment platforms to mask the trail. But the investigator was an ex-federal agent who knew exactly how to follow the money. The funds did not stay with Darren or Megan. The entire sum was wired directly into an offshore account controlled by a notorious syndicate of underground sports bookies. The $15,000 my son stole from my emergency reserve was explicitly used to pay off a violent high-interest gambling debt. And the debt did not even belong to Darren. The illicit account was registered under a discreet alias tied directly to Tom. My son had robbed his own father to save his father-in-law from having his legs broken by dangerous loan sharks. The absolute depravity of this entire family alliance was finally laid bare under the harsh fluorescent lights of the law office. Tom and Nancy were not just financially irresponsible suburbanites trying to maintain a superficial country club facade. They were desperate, degenerate frauds, drowning in the dangerous, unforgiving underworld of illegal gambling. The pristine golf attire, the leased designer handbags, and the arrogant lectures about generational wealth were nothing but a fragile, desperate smokescreen meant to hide their rotting reality. Tom had gambled away their retirement, their home equity, and their social standing. When the loan sharks started circling their property, threatening them with severe physical violence and public exposure, they panicked. They needed a massive influx of cash, and they needed it immediately. That was the true genesis of this entire sickening conspiracy. Tom and Nancy had colluded directly with Darren and Megan to target my assets. They orchestrated the hostile takeover of my 4-bedroom house, the fraudulent conservatorship, and the aggressive psychological warfare not to secure a safe environment for an unborn grandchild, but to liquidate my real estate and save Tom from the violent consequences of his own severe addiction. My son had completely abandoned his loyalty to me, choosing instead to protect the pathetic, crumbling illusion of his white in-law's upper-class lifestyle. He viewed the black father who had sacrificed everything to raise him as nothing more than a convenient disposable piggy bank to pay off a gambling syndicate. The sheer reality of their collusion tested the absolute limits of my composure. They had sat across from me at that upscale restaurant, looking me dead in the eye, pretending to care about family values while actively plotting to strip me of my wealth to cover a bookie tab. They believed their manufactured proximity to whiteness and wealth made them superior, untouchable, and entitled to the fruits of my lifelong labor. I felt a cold, dark wave of disgust wash over me. I had spent 40 years navigating the systemic traps designed to keep men like me in poverty, only to find the most dangerous predators sitting right inside my own living room. I looked across the heavy mahogany desk at Mr. Mitchell. The seasoned litigator was already anticipating my next command, his pen poised over a fresh legal pad. I did not want to merely hand this mountain of evidence over to the local police and watch Tom and Nancy flee the state into obscure hiding. I wanted to personally own their destruction. I instructed Mr. Mitchell to instantly mobilize the anonymous limited liability company we had previously used to purchase Darren eviction notice. I wanted my corporate entity to swallow Tom's financial existence whole. Mr. Mitchell immediately contacted his aggressive network of specialized debt brokers and corporate collection agencies. In the murky, cutthroat world of high-risk debt, bad paper is bought and sold every single day for pennies on the dollar. Using my heavily shielded corporate entity, my lawyer aggressively negotiated the absolute purchase of Tom's entire portfolio of defaulted loans, maxed out credit lines, and outstanding promissory notes. We even managed to buy out the commercial debt he owed to the regional casino affiliates who were preparing to sue him. I authorized the transfer of the funds from my secure accounts without a single second of hesitation. Within 48 hours, the complex legal paperwork was signed, sealed, and firmly in my possession. The anonymous LLC, completely controlled by me, was now the sole legal proprietor of every single dollar Tom and Nancy owed to the world. I had officially become their ultimate master creditor. I held the absolute legal authority to garnish their wages, seize their remaining physical assets, freeze their bank accounts, and drag them into open court for devastating civil judgments. They were currently packing their bags, frantically trying to flee the state to escape their ruthless creditors, completely unaware that their primary creditor was now the very man they had tried to lock in a psychiatric ward. I held the iron leash to their entire future, and I had wrapped it tightly around their throats. I was not going to let them run away from the wreckage they created. I was going to pull them violently back into the light and watch their fake empire crumble brick by brick. While I was quietly cementing my absolute financial dominance over both generations of this deceitful family, Megan remained blissfully, arrogantly oblivious to the catastrophic death sentence hanging directly over her head. Believing that the medical conservatorship was still moving forward and that her parents were successfully managing the legal fallout, she decided to double down on her fake socialite persona. My private investigator intercepted a digital invitation circulating among the most affluent women in our area. Megan was throwing herself an obscenely lavish, wildly extravagant baby shower. Unable to use my blocked credit cards, she had resorted to securing highly predatory high-interest payday loans and maxing out a handful of unverified retail credit accounts to fund the massive spectacle. She rented out the grand ballroom of a luxury downtown hotel, ordering custom imported floral arrangements, a towering designer cake, and cases of expensive catered champagne. She was preparing to gather all her fake friends and wealthy acquaintances to celebrate a child while sitting on a fragile throne built entirely of fraudulent debt and pathetic lies. She had meticulously set the perfect stage for her own spectacular public execution, completely unaware that I was standing right in the shadows holding the match. The grand ballroom of the downtown hotel was a sickening display of manufactured elegance. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, while massive floral arrangements of white roses and imported orchids dominated every table. A string quartet played softly in the corner, providing the perfect soundtrack for a room full of affluent women sipping expensive champagne. At the center of it all stood Megan, glowing in a tailored designer maternity dress that cost more than most people made in a month. She held a crystal flute of sparkling cider, lightly tapping it with a silver spoon to command the attention of her 50 guests. As the room fell silent, she began her practiced performance. She placed a protective hand over her stomach and delivered a tearful, perfectly calibrated speech about resilience. She spoke about the profound trials her growing family had faced recently, subtly hinting at the dark, toxic presence of an abusive father-in-law who had tried to cast them out onto the streets. She thanked her parents, Tom and Nancy, who stood proudly by her side for being her absolute pillars of strength during such a harrowing emotional ordeal. She wiped away a single graceful tear, praising her husband Darren for shielding their unborn child from a hateful, unstable old man. The audience gasped in synchronized sympathy, murmuring their support and offering pitiful smiles. It was a masterclass in manipulation, a flawlessly executed theater production where the true villains were crowned as noble martyrs. I stood just outside the heavy double doors of the ballroom, completely concealed by the shadows of the corridor, watching the entire grotesque spectacle unfold. The sheer, unadulterated hypocrisy on display made my stomach turn. Through the slightly parted doors, I observed men in tailored suits and women draped in fine jewelry raising their expensive crystal glasses to toast my son and his wife. They were drinking premium champagne and dining on gourmet catering, utterly blind to the fact that the entire celebration was funded by stolen money, predatory payday loans, and maxed-out retail credit. There stood Tom and Nancy, beaming with manufactured aristocratic pride, accepting the admiration of the room as if they were the grand benefactors of this family. They played the role of the affluent, protective grandparents flawlessly. Not a single person in that luxurious ballroom knew that the man smiling so warmly in his custom polo shirt was a degenerate gambler who owed hundreds of thousands of dollars to violent underground loan sharks. No one knew that the loving husband Darren, standing with his arm wrapped securely around his wife, was a disgraced, fired embezzler who was exactly 14 days away from being physically thrown out of his apartment by the county sheriff. They were all dancing on the deck of a sinking ship, convinced they were invincible because they had managed to temporarily silence an old black contractor. I looked at my own hands, callous and scarred from decades of hauling lumber, laying brick, and pouring concrete in the blistering sun. I had sacrificed my youth and my body to build a legitimate, honorable empire. They believed they could simply swoop in, declare me insane, and hijack my legacy to pay for their fake country club lives. They thought their proximity to whiteness, their suburban zip codes, and their polished vocabulary made them inherently superior and legally untouchable. I adjusted the lapels of my charcoal gray suit, the exact same suit I wore when I dismantled Tom at the golf club. I did not feel a single ounce of hesitation or mercy. I was holding 3 thick black leather portfolios in my left hand. Each one contained a legally binding death sentence for their social and financial lives. I waited for the applause following Megan's tearful speech to peak. Then I pushed the heavy oak doors wide open and stepped directly into the light. The heavy oak doors swung open with a resounding thud that echoed sharply over the string quartet. The music faltered and died. 50 pairs of eyes turned toward the entrance. Megan's triumphant smile froze instantly, shattering as if it were made of cheap glass. Darren took a sudden, terrified step backward, physically putting distance between himself and his wife. Tom and Nancy turned pale, the color draining from their faces so fast they looked like corpses. I did not shout. I did not rush. I walked straight down the center aisle of the ballroom with the slow, deliberate cadence of an executioner. The wealthy guests parted like the Red Sea, murmuring in confusion as I approached the extravagant head table. I stopped directly in front of Megan, looking down at her perfectly manicured hands, trembling against her designer dress. I raised the 3 black leather portfolios and dropped them onto the table with a loud, heavy smack that rattled the fine china. "I suggest you open your gifts," I said, my voice deep, resonant, and carrying to every corner of the silent ballroom. "Since your parents claim to be your financial saviors, let us show your guests exactly what kind of foundation your family is built upon." I pointed to the first portfolio. "That is an official court-ordered eviction notice for Darren and Megan luxury apartment, along with Darren termination letter for corporate embezzlement. You have exactly 14 days before the sheriff throws your belongings onto the pavement." I shifted my finger to the second portfolio, locking my eyes entirely on Tom. "That is the complete legally transferred portfolio of Tom massive defaulted underground gambling debts. My corporate entity purchased every single penny you owe to those loan sharks. I am your sole creditor now, Tom, and I am calling in the debt immediately. Prepare to lose everything you own." The entire ballroom gasped in unison. A woman in the front row covered her mouth in absolute horror. Finally, I tapped the third portfolio. And that is a drafted criminal complaint detailing $15,000 in credit card fraud, identity theft, and a failed conspiracy to commit medical perjury. It is being submitted to the district attorney first thing tomorrow morning. The absolute silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the sound of Nancy letting out a stifled, high-pitched sob. The wealthy guests, the people Megan had tried so desperately to impress, did not offer sympathy. They recognized a toxic radioactive scandal when they saw one. Within seconds, the collective embarrassment shifted into a frantic exodus. Chairs scraped loudly against the floor as the affluent attendees grabbed their coats and purses, rushing toward the exit to avoid being associated with a family of disgraced criminals. In less than 5 minutes, the grand ballroom was completely abandoned by the guests, leaving only a wasteland of half-empty champagne flutes and untouched catered food. The pristine illusion of their high society family unit instantly disintegrated into feral, chaotic violence. Without the audience to maintain their polite facade, the panic mutated into raw, vicious rage. Tom, his face completely purple with fury and terror over his exposed gambling debts, lunged forward and slapped Darren viciously across the face. The sharp crack echoed through the empty hall. "You worthless, pathetic failure," Tom screamed, his voice cracking. "You promised you had this handled. You promised he was out of the way." Darren stumbled back, holding his reddened cheek, but he did not cower. He turned his explosive, unhinged anger directly onto Megan. He pointed a shaking finger at her, screaming that this was her fault, her greedy parents' fault, and that her pathetic need to show off was dragging him into a federal prison cell. Megan shrieked back at him, her carefully styled hair flying wildly as she cursed her husband for being a useless, unemployed fraud. I stood a few feet away, watching them tear each other to shreds like rabid animals locked in a cage. I buttoned my suit jacket, turned my back on the screaming, miserable wreckage of their alliance, and walked out of the hotel. The public humiliation was complete, but I was not finished. The final nail in their coffin was about to be delivered. The rhythmic pounding of the rain against the roof of my 4-bedroom house matched the steady, relentless beating of my heart. I was sitting in my leather armchair, sipping a glass of bourbon, allowing the absolute silence of my living room to wash over me after the chaotic spectacle at the downtown hotel. The digital clock on the mantel read just past midnight when the frantic, desperate pounding began at my front door. I did not rush. I picked up my smartphone and pulled up the high-definition security camera feed. Standing on my porch, completely drenched by the freezing, torrential downpour, was Darren. His expensive, tailored suit, the same one he wore while standing proudly at his fraudulent baby shower, was soaked through and plastered to his skin. He was not standing tall with the arrogance of a corporate manager anymore. My 32-year-old son was physically on his knees, shivering against the biting wind, pressing his face against the heavy oak wood of my door. I set my glass down, walked into the hallway, and pulled open the door. Darren collapsed forward onto the threshold, weeping with loud, ugly, guttural sobs. He did not demand anything this time. He looked up at me with red, swollen eyes and immediately began to frantically shift the blame. He swore that the entire conservatorship plot, the stolen credit cards, and the hostile takeover of my property were entirely orchestrated by Megan and her parents. He claimed he was just a desperate, terrified pawn, caught in their web of debts, completely manipulated by the wealthy white family he had married into. He begged for my forgiveness, pleading for me to let him inside, insisting that he had finally seen their true colors and wanted his real father back. Looking down at my son shivering on the wet hardwood floor of my entryway, a fleeting, dangerous flicker of paternal instinct flared up in my chest. For a fraction of a second, the towering, disgraced embezzler vanished, and I saw the small boy I used to take to construction sites on Saturday mornings. I remembered teaching him how to read a tape measure, how to grip a hammer, and how to carry himself with the pride of a black man who earned every single thing he owned. Seeing him reduced to a pathetic, weeping mess on the floor genuinely hurt. It was the tragic, undeniable grief of a father witnessing the ultimate failure of his own flesh and blood. Darren, possessing the cunning instincts of a cornered animal, immediately sensed that microscopic hesitation in my posture. He lunged forward, grabbing the hem of my trousers with wet, trembling hands, and deployed the most manipulative weapon he had left in his arsenal. He brought up the unborn baby. He cried that he was about to be a father and that his child was going to be born into a nightmare of bankruptcy and criminal investigations. He begged me to think about the legacy of our family name. He promised that if I just dropped the criminal complaint, forgave the offshore gambling debt, and let him stay in his childhood bedroom, he would divorce Megan immediately. He swore he would take full custody of the baby and raise my grandchild right here in this house, far away from the toxic, rotting influence of Tom and Nancy. He painted a desperate emotional picture of a redeemed son and a loving grandfather raising the next generation together, united against the deceitful in-laws. He pleaded that the innocent child in Megan belly did not deserve to pay for the sins of its mother or the desperate mistakes of its father. He wailed that the baby would be homeless by the end of the month, born in a charity ward because the sheriff was going to evict them from the luxury apartment. He clawed at my empathy, demanding I overlook decades of his arrogance and deceit for the sake of a child that had not even taken its first breath. I did not reach down to help him up. I did not offer him a dry towel or a warm cup of coffee. I looked at the man clutching my pant leg and felt the last remaining ember of my fatherly compassion go completely cold. His willingness to instantly throw his pregnant wife to the wolves, offering to abandon her and steal her child just to save his own skin from a fraud conviction, confirmed exactly how utterly devoid of morality my son had become. He was not a victim of Megan manipulation. He was a willing, enthusiastic participant who only regretted his actions because he got caught. I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out my smartphone, and opened the security application. I did not raise my voice or offer a passionate lecture about family values. I simply pressed the play button and turned the volume all the way up. The crisp, high-definition audio recording from the night he shattered my truck windshield echoed loudly through the quiet entryway. Darren's own drunken, venomous voice filled the air, screaming with absolute malice. I will take everything from you. I will take this house. I will drain your bank accounts, and I will take every single penny you have left. If you do not sign those papers, I will forge them myself. I will tell the judge you are completely insane. I will take everything, even if I have to lock you in a psych ward to do it. The recording stopped, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in the hallway, save for the sound of the rain pouring outside. Darren froze his hands, slowly slipping off my trousers. The color drained from his tear-streaked face as he realized the depth of his own fatal mistake. You were not manipulated, Darren, I said, my voice echoing with a final, unyielding, absolute authority. You chose to hunt me. You chose to destroy my mind and steal my wealth to cover up your pathetic failures. Greed is not something you learned from your in-laws. That corruption is in your own blood. You are a coward, a thief, and you are absolutely no son of mine. I stepped back, severing the physical connection between us, and grabbed the heavy brass handle of the oak door. I looked down at him one last time, shivering on the wet porch, and slammed the door shut. I locked all 3 deadbolts, sealing him outside in the freezing rain where he belonged. The next morning the storm had passed, leaving the neighborhood washed clean in the bright early sunlight. I sat in my kitchen, drinking my black coffee, feeling an unexpected sense of profound, undeniable peace. The emotional tumor had been fully excised. I had finally accepted the reality of who Darren was, completely untethering myself from the toxic obligation of blind parental loyalty. I was ready to let the district attorney and the civil courts systematically dismantle whatever was left of their miserable lives. But the universe was not finished exposing the absolute depths of their depravity. At precisely 9 in the morning, my cell phone rang. It was Mr. Mitchell. The seasoned, unflappable attorney sounded uncharacteristically urgent, his voice tight with a mixture of shock and professional adrenaline. He told me that our private investigator had just executed a preliminary legal subpoena on Megan, recent medical expenses, hoping to trace the fraudulent credit card charges back to specific prenatal clinics for the criminal complaint. What the investigator found buried in the leaked hospital billing codes was not just evidence of financial fraud. Mr. Mitchell took a sharp breath over the line and told me there was a massive, horrifying anomaly in her medical records. The unborn grandchild Darren had used as a human shield on my porch the night before was the center of their darkest, most sickening secret yet. The billing codes our private investigator managed to pull through the preliminary legal subpoena painted a chilling, undeniably clear picture of absolute medical fraud. Megan was not pregnant. According to the strictly confidential clinical data sitting firmly on my lawyer desk, she had tragically suffered a miscarriage over 5 months ago. There were highly specific billing records for a standard medical procedure related to the loss. but the paper trail completely and abruptly vanished right there. There were 0 ongoing prenatal checkups, no recent ultrasound appointments, no blood work, and absolutely no obstetrician bills filed since that date. The woman who had stood in the center of that grand hotel ballroom, gently cradling her stomach and weeping softly about the safety of her unborn child, was wearing a silicone prosthetic belly. She had weaponized a phantom pregnancy to create a manufactured ticking clock. She knew that simply asking for a 4-bedroom house to cover her husband's financial ruin would never work. But presenting herself as a vulnerable, weeping mother needing an immediate nursery for a baby due in a few short months provided the perfect emotional battering ram. She had used a fake baby to try and bulldoze through my boundaries and force a rapid, unquestioned transfer of my property deed before the truth could ever be discovered. The sheer sociopathic scale of this deception crossed every conceivable moral boundary. I sat at my kitchen table staring blankly at the wall, struggling to comprehend the absolute darkness required to orchestrate a lie of that magnitude. To stand in front of your family, your friends, and your community accepting expensive gifts and profound sympathy for a child that simply did not exist required a level of cold-blooded malice that genuinely terrified me. But as the initial shock slowly subsided, a different, much more pathetic realization began to take shape in my mind. Darren did not know. My son was a thief, an embezzler, and a coward who was perfectly willing to lock his own father in a psychiatric ward to cover his dangerous gambling debts. But he was also a spectacular, manipulated fool. He genuinely believed he was fighting tooth and nail to secure a secure roof over the head of his future child. Megan had played him with devastating surgical precision. She recognized his arrogant desperation regarding his lost job and his looming eviction, and she actively fed it, twisting his panic into a weapon she could aim directly at my estate. Tom and Nancy likely knew the absolute truth, helping their daughter maintain the sickening illusion of a perfect upper-crust family expansion to save themselves from their own underground loan sharks. Darren had thrown away his corporate career, entirely alienated his father, and risked a massive federal fraud conviction to protect a woman who was actively deceiving him every single time she strapped on that fake belly in the morning. He had destroyed his entire life and legacy for an absolute mirage. The irony was heavy and suffocating. My son thought he was the brilliant mastermind of a flawless real estate heist, but he was nothing more than a pathetic disposable pawn in his wife's psychotic theater production. The old Eugene, the father who still held on to a microscopic shred of hope for his boy, might have picked up the phone. I might have called him to warn him about the monster he had married. I might have tried to soften the devastating blow of losing a child he thought was still on the way. But that father died the moment Darren grabbed my winter coat on the porch and explicitly threatened to forge psychiatric evaluation papers. I did not owe him a comforting conversation, and I absolutely refused to give Megan any opportunity to intercept the information and spin a new complex web of lies to save herself. I instructed Mr. Mitchell to compile a certified, irrefutable dossier of the subpoenaed medical billing records. I wanted the specific dates, the medical procedures, and the absolute lack of current obstetric care highlighted in bright yellow ink. I did not include a personal note. I did not add a single word of fatherly commentary. The cold, sterile medical facts were brutal enough on their own. I hired a bonded, specialized legal courier, the exact kind used to serve high-level corporate lawsuits. I gave the courier explicit, non-negotiable instructions. The sealed, heavy envelope was to be delivered directly to Darren Holloway at his luxury apartment, and it had to be placed physically into his bare hands. I expressly forbade dropping it at the concierge desk and absolutely banned handing it to his wife under any circumstances. I paid double the standard rate for expedited real-time tracked service. I sat in my living room watching the digital tracking link update on my smartphone with the cold, detached precision of a demolition expert waiting for the countdown timer to hit 0. At precisely 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the tracking status updated to delivered. A digital signature was acquired. Darren had the papers. The undeniable truth was officially inside their failing, debt-ridden apartment. I set my phone down, poured myself a fresh cup of black coffee, and waited for the inevitable explosion. I did not have to wait long at all. Less than an hour after the courier confirmed the successful delivery, my private investigator sent me a frantic real-time text message update. He had been quietly monitoring the perimeter of their luxury building, waiting to gauge any potential fallout. The explosion was not just metaphorical. It was a terrifying, violently physical eruption. According to the investigator on the ground, a horrifying domestic brawl had just broken out on the 12th floor. The deafening sounds of heavy furniture being smashed against the drywall and glass shattering violently echoed all the way down into the pristine public hallways. Terrified neighbors were flooding the apartment management switchboard with emergency noise complaints. Darren was screaming at the absolute top of his lungs, his voice completely unhinged and ragged, tearing through the quiet corridors of the luxury complex. Minutes later, the sharp, piercing wail of approaching sirens cut through the busy city streets. Two police cruisers screeched to an aggressive halt directly in front of the glass lobby doors, with armed officers rushing into the building. The fragile fake empire they had built together was finally burning straight to the ground. The ringing of my cell phone sliced through the quiet, heavy atmosphere of my living room. It was not a text message from my private investigator or a late-night update from my attorney. The caller ID glaring on the screen displayed the unmistakable bold lettering of the city police department. I answered the call with the steady, measured breathing of a man who already knew exactly what the voice on the other end was going to say. A desk sergeant introduced himself, his tone carrying that specific, weary authority of a law enforcement officer dealing with a messy, violent domestic disturbance. He officially informed me that my son, Darren Holloway, had just been taken into police custody and was currently sitting in a holding cell at the downtown precinct. The sergeant described a scene of absolute unhinged devastation. According to the responding officers on the police report, Darren had completely lost his mind upon reading the certified medical documents I sent him. He had systematically and ruthlessly destroyed their luxury apartment. He shattered the floor-to-ceiling mirrors, smashed their expensive imported furniture to splinters, and reportedly hurled Megan's fake silicone pregnancy belly straight through a glass patio door. The neighbors on the 12th floor had flooded the emergency dispatch lines, terrified by the screaming and the sounds of heavy destruction. When the officers breached the apartment doors, they found Darren in a state of blind, hysterical rage, surrounded by the wreckage of his fake life. He was immediately restrained, read his rights, and booked on multiple serious felony charges. The list included severe destruction of property, disturbing the peace, and domestic assault. The polished illusion of my son as a sophisticated, untouchable corporate executive was officially dead, instantly replaced by the grim mugshot of a disgraced violent vandal sitting behind iron bars. But the most staggering part of the evening was not Darren's predictable explosive meltdown. It was Megan's immediate venomous pivot. The woman was a true, calculating sociopath, entirely incapable of feeling shame or remorse. Even as her husband was being handcuffed and dragged out of their ruined apartment by armed police officers, she was already executing her next financial survival strategy. Within hours of the arrest, my private investigator intercepted a flurry of urgent, desperate legal filings. Megan wasted absolutely no time playing her absolute favorite role. She immediately filed an emergency restraining order against Darren, painting herself to the courts as the terrified, traumatized victim of an unpredictable, abusive monster. But she did not stop there. Before the sun even rose the next morning, she officially filed for a highly contested divorce. The legal demands she submitted in her paperwork were nothing short of a delusional masterpiece. She aggressively demanded maximum spousal support, lifelong alimony, and a mandatory 50% split of their marital assets. I sat at my kitchen table the next morning reading the preliminary divorce filings my lawyer forwarded to my encrypted email, and I actually let out a harsh, bitter laugh. Megan was aggressively demanding half of a financial black hole. She was fiercely negotiating for her share of a corporate salary that no longer existed because Darren had been fired for embezzlement. She wanted equity from a luxury apartment that was weeks behind on rent and actively under an eviction order held by my anonymous corporate entity. She was completely oblivious to the fact that the man she was trying to bleed dry was drowning in a catastrophic ocean of debt. She hired a sleazy, high-priced divorce attorney on a predatory credit line, foolishly believing that she could somehow use the family courts to legally siphon my wealth through Darren. Her relentless greed blinded her to the stark reality that she was chaining herself to a rapidly sinking anchor. The desk sergeant on the phone cleared his throat, snapping my attention back to the present moment in my quiet living room. He told me that Darren had used his one legally permitted phone call from the booking area to contact the precinct desk, desperately begging the officers to reach out to his wealthy father. The sergeant asked me the pivotal question, his voice carrying a faint hint of expectation. He asked if I would be coming down to the station tonight to post bail and arrange private legal counsel for my son. I held the phone to my ear, letting the heavy silence stretch out across the line. Decades of memories flashed through my mind in rapid succession. I remembered bailing Darren out of a minor traffic scrape when he was an arrogant teenager. I remembered paying his expensive college tuition, buying his first reliable car, and handing him the hefty cash down payment for his first apartment. I had spent my entire adult life acting as his permanent, unconditional safety net, shielding him from the harsh consequences of his own actions. But the man sitting in that holding cell was not a misguided youth making a simple mistake. He was an arrogant, malicious adult who had actively plotted to strip me of my civil rights, steal the house I built with his late mother, and lock me in a psychiatric ward just to cover up his own pathetic failures. He had brought this absolute, undeniable destruction entirely upon himself. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the very last remaining thread of parental obligation snap cleanly in two. I spoke into the receiver with a chilling, absolute calmness that left no room for negotiation. I told the sergeant that I would not be posting any bail, nor would I be sending a defense lawyer to the precinct. I stated clearly his behavior is not my problem. I hung up the phone without waiting for a response, severing the connection and leaving my son to spend the night shivering on a cold concrete bench. While Darren sat abandoned in a county jail cell and Megan spun her desperate web of divorce lies, the ultimate shockwave finally hit her parents. Stripped of their fake socialite daughter financial backing and realizing the conservatorship plot had completely failed, Tom and Nancy were left utterly defenseless. The legal machinations of my anonymous limited liability company struck them with terrifying, inescapable speed. Without the promised influx of cash from my stolen property, their violent underground creditors closed in fast. The very next morning, aggressive repossession agents arrived at their pristine suburban home with flatbed tow trucks. The disgraced couple was forced to frantically hand over the keys to their leased luxury cars to avoid immediate criminal fraud charges. With the neighborhood watching from their windows, Tom and Nancy packed their remaining designer clothes into a few suitcases and fled their affluent zip code in absolute, undeniable disgrace. They were forced to relocate to a cheap rundown motel in a dilapidated, dangerous section of the city, desperately hiding from the loan sharks they had tried so hard to pay off with my money. But their nightmare was just beginning. They had no idea that my corporate entity had officially filed the final writ of asset seizure, an inescapable legal death sentence hovering right above their heads, ready to strip them of the very last pennies they owned. I sat in the polished wooden pew of the county courthouse, wearing the same charcoal gray suit I wore when I first dismantled Tom at the country club. The courtroom was heavily air-conditioned, but the chill in the room radiated entirely from the defense table. The highly anticipated trial for criminal fraud, identity theft, and severe elder financial abuse had officially commenced. Darren was escorted in his corporate arrogance, entirely replaced by the trembling, exhausted posture of a man who had spent the last several weeks bouncing between holding cells and cheap bail bondsmen. Sitting a few feet away at the same defense table, actively avoiding any eye contact with her estranged husband, was Megan. She had traded her extravagant designer maternity dresses for a plain conservative blouse, attempting to look as unassuming and harmless as possible. Right behind them in the gallery sat Tom and Nancy, looking absolutely haggard, their country club tans fading into a sickly, stressed pallor as they hid from the aggressive debt collectors waiting for them outside. The state prosecutor stood before the judge and delivered an opening statement that cut through the silence like a scalpel. He did not paint this as a simple family misunderstanding. He methodically outlined a vicious, coordinated criminal conspiracy designed to exploit, medically gaslight, and financially ruin a 69-year-old widower. He detailed the stolen credit cards, the offshore wire transfers to illegal gambling syndicates, and the sociopathic fabrication of a pregnancy used as a weapon of property extortion. I watched the faces of the jury members as the sheer, calculated depravity of my son and his in-laws was laid completely bare. There was no sympathy in the jury box. There was only profound, unmistakable disgust. When it was time for the defense to present their case, the desperation in the room reached a fever pitch. Megan, high-priced divorce attorney acting as her criminal defense counsel, immediately tried to throw Darren entirely under the bus. He paraded Megan in front of the jury, prompting her to squeeze out a few pathetic, rehearsed tears. She testified that she was a terrified, manipulated housewife who had no idea her husband was embezzling corporate funds or stealing from his elderly father. She claimed Darren forced her to wear the silicone belly to secure housing because he was physically abusive when his financial schemes failed. Darren's own public defender retaliated with equal viciousness, arguing that Darren was suffering from severe mental breakdowns caused by the intense manipulative pressure from his wealthy white in-laws who demanded he maintain a luxury lifestyle. They were pointing fingers, tearing each other apart right there on the witness stand, desperately trying to salvage a shred of sympathy from the jury. But their theatrical performances completely shattered the moment the state prosecutor began introducing the hard, undeniable forensic evidence my legal team had meticulously compiled. The prosecutor projected the digital bank routing documents onto a massive screen, explicitly showing the $15,000 moving directly from my stolen credit card through a shell account and straight into the hands of Tom Violent Underground bookies. The paper trail was absolute. There was no plausible deniability. Then the prosecutor played the high-definition audio recording from my porch. Darren's drunken, venomous voice echoed through the sterile courtroom, screaming his exact intent to forge psychiatric papers and lock me in a mental ward to steal my real estate. The jury physically recoiled at the raw malice in his voice. Finally, the prosecutor submitted the certified medical subpoena proving Megan had not been pregnant for over 5 months, exposing her elaborate sociopathic fraud to the entire room. The defense attorneys stopped objecting. They sat back in their chairs, completely defeated by the sheer volume of irrefutable, deeply incriminating evidence. The unholy alliance had tried to play the victims, but the digital receipts and the audio recordings exposed them as nothing more than ruthless calculating predators. The jury did not even need a full afternoon to deliberate. They returned with a unanimous, devastating verdict of guilty across the board. The presiding judge, an older, stern woman who had zero tolerance for elder exploitation, stared down at the defense table with absolute contempt. She delivered a scathing, humiliating rebuke that echoed off the courtroom walls, dismantling their fabricated entitlement piece by piece. She explicitly stated that in her 30 years on the bench, she had rarely seen a family unit so completely devoid of basic human morality. She handed down the sentences with the heavy, unyielding strike of her gavel. Darren and Megan were formally convicted of felony identity theft, financial fraud, and conspiracy. To ensure they could not simply rot in a county jail cell at the expense of the taxpayers, the judge strategically suspended their immediate prison sentences in favor of 5 years of maximum security, heavily monitored probation. However, this probation came with a crushing, inescapable mandate. She ordered them to pay full, complete financial restitution to me, down to the very last stolen cent, including all my extensive legal fees. If they missed a single scheduled payment, their probation would be instantly revoked and they would be thrown directly into a state penitentiary. Furthermore, any remaining assets they had were legally seized. The judge ruling meant they would be working grueling minimum wage jobs for the next half-decade, solely to pay back the father they tried to destroy. Tom and Nancy, sitting in the gallery, realized their fate was equally sealed. My anonymous corporate entity officially finalized the civil judgments against them that very same afternoon, seizing their remaining bank accounts and forcing them into absolute catastrophic bankruptcy. The luxurious, untouchable empire they believed they were entitled to was officially reduced to ash. The sinister alliance between my son, his manipulative wife, and her fraudulent parents was completely, permanently annihilated. They walked out of that courtroom as convicted felons and penniless debtors, stripped of their pride, their property, and their futures. I sat in my pew feeling the heavy, suffocating weight of the past few months finally lift off my shoulders. The system had actually worked, driven entirely by my refusal to be a silent victim. I walked out of the heavy glass doors of the courthouse and stepped into the bright, late-afternoon sunlight alongside Mr. Mitchell. We exchanged a firm, respectful handshake, acknowledging the absolute flawless victory we had just secured. I walked across the vast concrete parking lot toward my newly repaired truck, ready to drive home and finally enjoy the profound silence of my property. But as I unlocked the driver's side door, a figure stepped out from behind the adjacent vehicle, physically blocking my path to the driver's seat. It was Darren. He was no longer wearing the county-issued jumpsuit, having been formally processed out on his highly restrictive probation, but he looked completely hollowed out. He was trembling, his shoulders slumped in absolute defeat, possessing absolutely nowhere to go. The luxury apartment was gone, his wife despised him, and his career was permanently erased. He looked up at me with exhausted, bloodshot eyes and begged me for just one single night on my living room couch. He whispered that he was entirely homeless, that he had less than $20 in his pocket, and that he was facing the terrifying reality of sleeping on the dangerous city streets tonight. I stood perfectly still on the hot sun-baked asphalt of the courthouse parking lot, staring down at the pathetic, shivering shell of the man I had raised. Darren reached out a trembling hand, his eyes bloodshot and wide with a genuine, unadulterated terror that he had never experienced a single day in his privileged life. He pleaded for just 12 hours of shelter. He promised he would sleep on the bare, hardwood floor, that he would leave long before sunrise, and that he just needed a safe place to figure out his next move. The sheer blinding audacity of his request, asking for sanctuary in the very 4-bedroom house he had actively tried to steal by locking me in a psychiatric ward, was staggering. I looked at the sweat and grime streaking his face. There was a time when a single tear from my boy would have sent me moving mountains to fix his world. But the father who would have saved him died the night Darren stood on my porch and threatened to forge my medical records to secure his inheritance. I did not offer him a parting lecture, nor did I raise my voice to mock his spectacular downfall. I simply looked him dead in the eye and slowly, definitively shook my head. I reached out, firmly removed his hand from the door handle of my truck, and stepped up into the driver's seat. I started the heavy engine, the familiar, powerful rumble vibrating through the cabin. Darren stumbled back, his mouth opening in silent, absolute disbelief as I shifted the gear into drive. I pulled out of the parking space, leaving my 32-year-old son standing entirely alone in the vast, empty lot. I did not check my rearview mirror once as I merged onto the busy main road. The drive back to my quiet suburban neighborhood was the longest, heaviest commute of my entire life. The silence inside the cab of my truck was absolute, but my mind was a chaotic, punishing storm of grief and finality. Cutting off your own flesh and blood is never a victorious, triumphant feeling. It feels like performing an unanesthetized amputation on your own body to stop a lethal spreading infection from reaching your heart. It leaves a massive phantom ache that you know will linger in the background for the rest of your days. I parked in the driveway and walked through the solid oak front door I had hung by myself decades ago. The house was completely empty, echoing with the ghosts of past Christmases, Sunday dinners, and the booming laughter of a family unit that no longer existed. I walked into the kitchen and sat at the table where Diane and I had spent thousands of hours planning Darren's future. We had poured every ounce of our energy, our financial resources, and our unconditional love into ensuring he would never have to struggle the way we did. We shielded him from the harsh, prejudiced realities of the world, hoping to raise a strong, independent black man. Instead, our excessive shielding created a fragile, entitled parasite who believed he could simply cannibalize his elders when his own poor choices caught up with him. As I sat in the quiet dusk of my living room, the profound emptiness began to transform into a stark, undeniable clarity. If I allowed myself to be anchored by the guilt of a father mourning a failed son, I would never truly escape the psychological prison they had tried to build for me. The only way to survive this ultimate betrayal was to completely sever the physical tethers to that painful past. This 4-bedroom house built with blood and sweat had become the toxic obsession that triggered my son Malice. It was no longer a peaceful sanctuary. It was a standing monument to their greed. I realized that keeping the property was keeping the wound wide open. To truly experience a rebirth, I needed to liquidate the very prize they had fought so ruthlessly to steal. The very next morning, I did not call a commercial real estate broker. I reached out directly to a prominent, deeply respected African-American philanthropic organization operating right in the heart of our city. They were a dedicated charity group focused on providing safe transitional housing and intensive mentorship for at-risk displaced minority youth. I invited their board of directors to privately tour my property. When they saw the expansive square footage, the sturdy, impeccable foundation, and the massive, secure backyard, they were overwhelmed by the potential. But they cautiously admitted that a pristine 4-bedroom suburban home in this specific zip code was vastly outside their nonprofit budget limits. I sat down with their lead director and offered them an immediate private off-market sale at a massive, undeniably generous discount. I slashed the asking price to a mere fraction of its market value, structuring the sale as a partially donated philanthropic gift. My only condition was that the transaction be finalized rapidly and the house be used exclusively as a permanent sanctuary for young men who actually needed a firm foundation to build their lives upon. The board accepted immediately, tears of genuine gratitude in their eyes. Over the next 2 weeks, I systematically packed up 40 years of history. I carefully boxed up Diane's prized book collection, her delicate porcelain figures, and the framed photographs of a younger, happier time. I sorted through my heavy contracting tools, donating the bulk of them directly to the charity trade skills program. As I taped up the final cardboard box, I felt an overwhelming, powerful surge of liberation. I was taking the exact asset that had corrupted my son and transforming it into a vital lifeline for young men who would actually appreciate the incredible value of a safe home. The transaction closed smoothly, transferring the deed completely out of my name and permanently placing the property into an untouchable charitable trust. The kingdom Darren had tried to conquer was officially gone. A week after the closing, the local community newspaper ran a prominent glowing front-page feature on the charity new acquisition. The article highlighted the massive philanthropic discount I had provided and showcased a high-resolution photograph of the sprawling 4-bedroom house now officially dedicated as the Holloway Youth Sanctuary. Down at the county probation office, Darren sat in a bleak fluorescent-lit waiting room, waiting to check in with his strict parole officer before heading back to the cramped, miserable cot at the local men's shelter. He picked up a discarded copy of that very newspaper left on a plastic chair. He casually turned to the front page and froze instantly. His sunken, exhausted eyes locked onto the image of his childhood home, the very property he had committed federal felonies to steal. As he read the headline detailing the permanent transfer of the multi-million-dollar estate into an untouchable charitable trust, the crushing, inescapable reality of his actions finally hit him. He had not just lost a legal battle. He had systematically, single-handedly burned his own guaranteed generational inheritance straight to the ground. The vibration of my cell phone broke the quiet, settled peace of my temporary leased apartment. I had recently moved into a highly secure upscale building downtown, while I finalized my long-term living arrangements, enjoying the absolute tranquility that comes with total financial independence. I looked down at the glowing caller ID on the screen. It was an unfamiliar local number, likely a public payphone or a cheap prepaid landline. I answered it, fully expecting a call from the charity legal team wrapping up some minor administrative details regarding the final deed transfer. Instead, the ragged, heavy breathing on the other end of the line instantly told me exactly who was calling. It was Darren. He was calling from whatever rundown, miserable halfway house or dilapidated motel his strict probation officer had approved for his mandatory registered address. He had clearly just finished reading the front page of the local community newspaper. He did not say hello. He did not ask how I was doing or apologize for his actions. He bypassed any pretense of a normal conversation and immediately launched into a hysterical, sobbing tirade. His voice echoed with a toxic, terrifying mixture of absolute devastation and venomous hatred. He screamed into the receiver, demanding to know why I was so incredibly cruel. He wailed that I had taken the absolute last remaining safety net he had in this world and maliciously handed it over to a bunch of complete strangers just to spite him. He cried that he was currently sleeping on a stained mattress in a tiny room that smelled like bleach and despair, surrounded by dangerous strangers, while I was out playing the generous, celebrated neighborhood philanthropist. He asked me how a father could be so completely heartless, so utterly vindictive to permanently disinherit his own flesh and blood when he was already sitting at absolute rock bottom. He sobbed uncontrollably into the phone, claiming I had actively and intentionally destroyed his final shred of hope. I sat in my comfortable leather chair by the window, holding the phone to my ear, listening to the agonizing sound of a 32-year-old man entirely consumed by his own delusional victimhood. Even after standing in a criminal courtroom, even after receiving a felony conviction and a suspended prison sentence, Darren had absolutely zero capacity for genuine self-reflection. He spent the next 5 minutes delivering a frantic, breathless monologue of aggressive deflection. He refused to take a single ounce of accountability. He blamed his staggering financial ruin entirely on Megan, claiming her insatiable appetite for designer brands and luxury vacations forced him to embezzle from his corporate employer just to keep her happy. He blamed Tom and Nancy for dragging him into their violent underworld gambling debts, insisting he was just a naive, desperate husband trying to protect his marriage from loan sharks. And finally, with breathtaking, unbelievable audacity, he blamed me. He told me that if I had just signed over the 4-bedroom house quietly at that upscale restaurant months ago, none of this nightmare would have ever happened. He argued that my stubborn pride and my selfish refusal to step aside for the next generation forced him to take desperate, extreme legal measures. He actually managed to convince himself that the fraudulent conservatorship, the stolen credit cards, and the plotted psychiatric commitment were all my fault because I refused to be a compliant, silent victim. He cried that I had deliberately set him up to fail. He moaned about the agonizing reality of his court-mandated probation, complaining bitterly about the random drug tests, the humiliating minimum wage job he was forced to work just to pay my court-ordered restitution, and the terrifying prospect of spending the next 5 years of his life walking on a razor-thin wire. He wanted me to feel a crushing, unbearable guilt for his consequences. He desperately wanted me to apologize for defending my own life. He wanted me to swoop in and validate the massive charity donation and magically restore his status as an entitled wealthy heir. He was a spectacular failure who absolutely refused to look in the mirror, permanently trapped in the toxic delusion that the entire universe owed him a luxury existence he had never actually earned. I let him finish his frantic, pathetic rant. I did not interrupt his sobbing, and I did not raise my voice to match his hysterical, elevated pitch. When he finally ran out of breath, leaving only the sound of static and his heavy, defeated panting on the line, I spoke. My voice was incredibly calm, dropping to a low, resonant timbre that carried absolute, unyielding finality. I told him that I spent 40 years of my life breaking my back on dangerous construction sites, swallowing my pride in rooms full of prejudiced men, and bleeding for every single dollar I earned, all so he could have a massive head start in life. I reminded him that I taught him how to be a proud, self-sufficient, honorable black man in a world that would happily see him fail. I gave him the absolute best foundation any father could possibly provide, but he took that foundation, decided it was not glamorous enough for his shallow tastes, and chose to become a hollow, parasitic fraud. I told him he chose to marry a woman who viewed me as disposable trash, and he actively chose to collude with a family of degenerate thieves to lock me in a psychiatric ward for my real estate. You ask me why I am so cruel, I said, the words cutting through the phone line like a sharpened steel blade. You think selling that house to a charity was a punishment designed to torture you. It was not a punishment, Darren. I am not being ruthless to punish you. I am being ruthless to save myself from your rot. I told him that his entitlement was a terminal disease, and if I allowed him to maintain even the smallest microscopic grip on my life or my assets, he would eventually drag me down into his miserable, self-inflicted grave. I explained that the house was now a permanent sanctuary for young men who actually wanted to build a future, rather than a stolen inheritance for a coward who only knew how to destroy one. I told him I did not hate him, but I absolutely no longer recognized the man speaking on the other end of the line. I did not feel anger anymore. I only felt a profound, permanent indifference. He was a grown man who had made his malicious choices, and now he was going to live the rest of his life chewing on the incredibly bitter consequences of his own actions. Darren let out a choked, desperate gasp on the other end of the line. He started to stammer, his voice cracking and hitching as he frantically tried to formulate another excuse, another pathetic plea for financial salvation or paternal mercy. He begged me not to hang up, swearing he could change, promising he would earn my respect back if I just gave him one more chance to prove his worth. I did not wait to hear the rest of his hollow, meaningless promises. I pulled the phone away from my ear and firmly pressed the end call button, instantly cutting off his voice and silencing his misery forever. I sat in my quiet, sunlit apartment for a long moment, feeling the final heavy chain of parental obligation detach completely from my soul. I removed the protective case from my smartphone. I retrieved a small metal pin from my desk drawer and popped open the side tray of the device. I carefully extracted the small plastic SIM card, the digital lifeline that had kept me tethered to a family that actively tried to destroy my sanity and steal my life's work. I held the tiny, fragile chip between my thumb and index finger, took a deep, cleansing breath of absolute freedom, and snapped it cleanly in half. I dropped the 2 jagged pieces of plastic into the kitchen trash can, listening to the satisfying, tiny click as they hit the bottom. That simple action was the final physical seal on my new life. I was done with temporary leases, transitional spaces, and living out of cardboard boxes. Later that same week, I officially closed on a sprawling top-floor penthouse right in the bustling heart of the downtown financial district. I traded the quiet, accessible suburban streets for a towering, impenetrable fortress of reinforced glass and steel. My new building featured 24-hour biometric security, a gated underground parking garage monitored by armed guards, and a private keycard-restricted elevator that opened directly into my personal foyer. The concierge desk downstairs had strict, unwavering, legally binding instructions. No unannounced visitors were ever allowed past the lobby, regardless of who they claimed to be or what tragic story they spun. I hired a team of elite white glove movers to handle the transition, watching as my carefully curated belongings were placed into the massive open-concept living space. Walking into that penthouse for the very first time was a breathtaking experience. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic, unobstructed view of the entire city skyline bathed in the golden light of the late afternoon sun. The silence in this apartment was fundamentally different from the quiet of my old four-bedroom house. That suburban silence used to be heavy, suffocating, constantly echoing with the ghosts of past family dinners and the lingering toxic anxiety of Darren's looming betrayals. The silence in this penthouse was crisp, clean, and fiercely independent. It was the undeniable sound of absolute autonomy. I walked across the polished hardwood floors feeling a profound, untouchable safety that no one could ever pry away from me again. I unpacked a small box containing a framed photograph of Diane, placing it gently on the sleek marble mantel. Looking at her smiling face, I allowed myself to deeply reflect on the grueling 40-year journey it took to reach this high-rise sanctuary. In the late 70s, being a young black man trying to break into the commercial contracting business was an exercise in daily, relentless humiliation. The banks routinely denied my commercial loan applications with fake, polite smiles, questioning my financial literacy simply because of the color of my skin. White suppliers intentionally delayed my material deliveries, testing my patience, hoping I would simply give up and go back to swinging a hammer for someone else's company for minimum wage. Diane and I ate cheap meals, drove trucks with rusting floorboards, and worked exhausting double shifts just to keep the lights on. Every single dollar I earned was a direct result of outworking, outsmarting, and outlasting a system entirely designed to see me fail. I built my wealth like a heavy, impenetrable fortress, believing that if I just accumulated enough financial armor, I could permanently protect my family from the racial and economic hardships I had endured. I wanted Darren to have a smooth, paved road entirely free from the potholes of prejudice and crushing poverty. But I realize now that by removing every obstacle from his path, I completely failed to teach him how to walk. I accidentally funded his arrogance. I gave him the luxury of entitlement, and he repaid me by attempting to strip away my fundamental human rights. For decades, I lived far below my means, hoarding my resources for a generational legacy that ultimately tried to destroy me. Sitting in this penthouse surrounded by luxury, I had previously denied myself. I finally granted myself permission to genuinely enjoy the fruits of my own agonizing labor. I was no longer a financial custodian for an ungrateful heir. I was a retired wealthy man who had survived the ultimate betrayal. I started buying original artwork that caught my eye. I booked first-class tickets for an extended vacation across Europe, something Diane and I always talked about but never found the time to do. The money I had spent my entire life fiercely guarding was finally serving its true purpose. It was funding my total peace. As the evening sun fully dipped below the horizon, painting the sprawling city skyline in vibrant shades of deep purple and bruised orange, I walked over to my custom wet bar. I took down a heavy crystal glass and poured myself a generous measure of a highly aged, incredibly expensive Kentucky bourbon. The amber liquid glowed warmly under the recessed lighting. I walked over to the massive glass window, the cool surface radiating a quiet comfort, and looked down at the bustling, illuminated city streets far below. From this height, the chaos of the world seemed small, manageable, and entirely distant. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the bourbon, letting the complex, smoky warmth settle deep in my chest. A profound, razor-sharp realization crystallized in my mind, washing away any lingering, microscopic doubts about the path I had chosen. Society constantly bombards us with the dangerous, toxic narrative that family is an absolute, unbreakable bond. We are conditioned from birth to believe that blood relations demand infinite patience, boundless financial support, and mandatory forgiveness, regardless of the severity of the offense. We are told to turn the other cheek to keep the peace and to silently endure abuse just to maintain the fragile illusion of a happy family unit. But standing here looking out over the empire I had reclaimed, I knew with absolute certainty that this narrative was a manipulative lie. Bloodline does not give anyone the right to be a parasite. Sharing a last name is not a permanent, unlimited access pass to my sanity, my property, or my hard-earned wealth. If a person, even your own flesh and blood, demonstrates that they are perfectly willing to throw you into a psychiatric facility and destroy your reputation just to cover their own pathetic debts, they forfeit every single privilege of family. They become a predator. And you do not negotiate with predators. You eliminate their access to your life. People often preach that the ultimate path to healing is forgiveness. They claim that you must forgive your abusers to truly move on and find closure. I completely reject that notion. The greatest, most profound liberation I have ever experienced was not found in forgiving Darren. It was found in the cold, permanent act of cutting him off. The ultimate freedom is realizing that you do not owe your life to those who only wish to consume it. My story is not a traditional, heartwarming tale of family reconciliation. It is a harsh, unfiltered lesson in self-preservation and the absolute necessity of enforcing brutal boundaries. Now, I want to turn the question over to you, the listeners who have followed this entire harrowing journey. What do you think about my final decision? Do you believe I was entirely justified in permanently severing all ties, changing my number, and leaving my son to face his severe criminal and financial consequences completely alone? Or do you subscribe to the belief that a parent should always leave the door cracked open for their child, no matter how egregious or unforgivable the betrayal? Would you have the incredible courage to legally and emotionally cut off your own flesh and blood if you were pushed to the absolute brink of destruction? Please let me know your honest thoughts and share your own experiences down in the comments below. I read every single one of them. If you found value in this story of survival justice and ultimate liberation, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more powerful life stories. Thank you for listening, and remember to always protect your peace. See you in the next video with love and respect. Looking out from my penthouse, surrounded by the peace, I fought so fiercely to reclaim another profound lesson settled heavily into my mind. As parents, especially those of us who survive the bitter sting of poverty and systemic prejudice, our deepest instinct is to give our children the effortless life we were entirely denied. We want to pave their roads with gold and remove every single stone that might cause them to stumble. But I learned the hard way that when you remove every struggle from a man's path, you completely destroy his ability to build character. I spent decades believing I was weaving a secure financial safety net for Darren. In reality, I was weaving a comfortable hammock. A safety net catches a person when they fall while striving to climb higher. A hammock simply allows them to lie completely still, arrogantly expecting the world to rock them to sleep. My unwavering generosity did not forge a strong, honorable man. It manufactured a weak, entitled parasite who viewed my grueling lifetime of labor as his personal, unlimited bank account. True love is not about shielding your adult children from the harsh storms of consequence. It is about demanding they learn how to build their own shelter. When you constantly write the check, when you continuously bail them out of their self-inflicted disasters, you actively rob them of the opportunity to develop basic integrity. Establishing ironclad financial boundaries is the ultimate, undeniable form of self-respect. Your hard-earned savings, your property, and your retirement are the sacred rewards for your sacrifices. They are absolutely not a slush fund for grown adults who refuse to take accountability for their own wretched failures. Do not ever finance your own disrespect. If you refuse to let anyone exploit your hard-earned legacy, hit the subscribe button right now and join a community that fiercely protects its peace.